Welcome to Science Fiction Stories, the home of my vintage paperback science fiction novel collection, all out-of-print books by many different authors. Sit back, hear the pages turn, and enjoy as we enter into a galaxy far, far away. Orbit 1 by author John A. Muller. Chapter 1: The Crash. Life on Kolar was not by any means easy. Kolar was the second planet in sequence revolving around vast Sirius for a sun. Colonist was hardly the term for those who scratched out a rather meager existence on Kolar. They were proto-colonists. The time would come when the Kolar Settlement Organization had completed the necessary ramifications to civilization, which would make the planet moderately habitable. Those ramifications were not completed. However, in the meantime, the experimental group of proto-colonists were proving fairly satisfactorily that Kolar could support life. No doubt, if you were anything other than humanoid, Kolar would probably be a very satisfactory planet indeed. There were vestigial evidences of valuable mineral deposits, valuable, that is, from the point of view of an industrial society, and there were other even more vestigial remains of what might be a heavy stretch of the imagination, have been termed ruins. There were strange things that looked like earth-covered mounds that could, by virtue of their spacing and by virtue of rather blackish-grey ash that seemed to hang over them, like an umbrella of dark soil put up to dry against the terrain. Perhaps by some great stretch of imagination they could have once been called cities. Were they the wreckage of cities? The colonists had no real time to investigate. It took them most of their time to get any kind of living out of the Kolar soil. As yet, no archaeological expeditions had come out from the main home worlds of the solar system. It was a long, difficult journey through the warp. Not so long as to be impossible, but it was a matter of months and months in space, which are not everybody's idea of a pleasant holiday afloat. So the Kolar proto-colonists struggled on as best they might. They struggled on in hope, for as soon as their efforts had proved that Kolar was worth investment on a planetary scale, then they would get the pioneer's reward, for what it was worth, of course. By that time, many of them might possibly have succumbed to any of the strange perils which a pioneer might expect to face on a practically unknown world. But, by and large, those who took up pioneering were activated by a spirit which was spaceless and timeless. In other words, a pioneer was very much the same kind of man, whether you met him in a covered wagon or in a rocket. There was a courage, a determination, a drive, a certain almost mule-headed stubbornness about the pioneering spirit, which would brook no denial whatever, and the Kolar colonists were certainly no exception. Big Dan Jeffries was ploughing, and as he ploughed he was reciting a line of Burns subconsciously. It was keeping him going, the same lines over and over again. I'm an honest man, I guide my plough, I eat my bread in the sweat of my brow. It seemed somehow a reason for going on. Gradually it came out of the subconscious into the consciousness itself. Big Dan Jeffries found himself saying it out loud. I'm an honest man, I guide my plough, I eat my bread in the sweat of my brow. The great mechanical cultivator continued to turn up the virgin soil of Kolar. But was it virgin soil? Wondered Big Dan. For when a man is sitting on a plough, he does at least get time to think, even if he doesn't get time for anything in the nature of practical exploration or archaeology. What if there was something after all in those strange rumors? What if there was something after all in those dark, grey, ash-covered mounds? Could they be the remains of a civilization? The administrator, Fletcher Starbuck, had seemed inclined to think they were. It troubled him a little. He wondered what had become of the civilization that had built and presumably destroyed those strange mounds, the graves of cities. Had they been cities, or were they just the result of natural volcanic phenomena? There was one on his right now. Dan Jeffries paused and looked. Gears and wheels, levers and plough, shares, they cracked and clanked behind him, and took his mind away from the grey-black mound. It was as though some strange underground troll of enormous size was pushing its umbrella up from under the earth, and was itself going to emerge from under it, huge, grinning, horrible, the product of radiogenetic mutation. He could almost imagine a gigantic ogre standing there with 3 eyes and possibly 2 heads. That was an interesting thought. Those old fairy tales back on Earth, things about ogres with 2 heads, what if they were the remains of another civilization? His thought went out in circles and then went back to his plough like a boomerang, a mental boomerang. Everything was queer, thought Dan Jeffries. There were more mysteries in heaven and earth than there were dreamed of in our philosophy. There were certainly more mysteries on the planet Kolar than were dreamed of in ordinary mortal philosophy. But it wasn't the mystery he was concerned with. The problem facing all the colonists was that somehow they had to remain on Kolar long enough to convince the Earth Federation that it was worth an investment. Once they had convinced them of that, then their own stakes would pay them very handsome dividends indeed. In fact, there would be practically no limit to the dividend. That was the gamble that a professional pioneer took. He went to planet after planet as Dan Jeffries had done. He went to planet after planet until he was sick of the sight of a spaceship, until his ears became nauseated. If an ear can become nauseated by the roar of a rocket, he got to hate the ships, to hate the planets, to hate his way of life. But still something inside him made him go on and do it. Once a man has committed himself to that kind of thing, he doesn't go back. There is an unwritten law among the pioneers that you don't go back. You get a taste of it for a time, and after a time, Dan Jeffries had had the taste of pioneering a long time ago and lost it. Now only a kind of dull apathy kept him doing what he was doing. How many planets had he tried? How many had been failures? Dismal, abject failures. How many times had he stuck it out winter and summer to prove to a seemingly heartless Earth Federation that this world, after all, was going to be worth planetary scale investment, only to find that the world was not suitable, and that the summer and winter of toil that he had put into the place, the sweat and the blood and the tears, had all been wasted, and that the colonists were being withdrawn and the project being abandoned as impractical. How many times? 50? 100? Not so many as that, he knew, deep down within himself, but it seemed more. It seemed a hell of a lot more. Big Dan Jeffries was fed up. He was fed up with the way that the Earth Federation was administered. He was fed up with the way that it seemed to him, as a disillusioned colonist, that the Federation began to pull out the stakes before there was a chance to see whether it would have been worthwhile. But what was the reward? What kept a man doing that? Dan Jeffries on the plough kept clanking on. The reward, he told himself, was a vast tract of land, enough land to make a man a multi-millionaire. If only he'd gotten in on the one planet that paid off. That was the thing. Getting in on that one that paid off. Pioneers are rather like fishermen. Oh, you should have seen the one that got away. You should have seen the planet I went to. Magnificent. The only thing, of course, was that the natural radiation background was about 5 times higher than even the most daring safety level. Otherwise, it was a wonderful place. You should have seen the one we went to. Only thing wrong with that was the water was poisoned. Everywhere. Poisoned with some strange organic poison for which there was no antidote and no remedy. We had to get out of there in a hurry. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been enough crew left to get us off. Poisoned atmosphere, poisoned water, glaring suns that drove a man mad, soil that nothing would grow in, soil that was so tough you couldn't plow it, soil that was so dry and dusty that not even all the modern irrigation techniques would have any effect on it, dust and heat and strange stinging insects that could kill a man. On every world there was something wrong as far as Homo sapiens was concerned, something that Homo sapiens couldn't handle. Everywhere, it was always the same, thought Dan Jeffries. Now there was going to be something wrong with this. It was tough going, and those moons didn't make it any better. His thoughts were cut short as he looked up into the sky. There was a rocket there, big, bright, and gleaming in the light of Sirius, shining in the sunlight. A strange sight, that rocket, against the primitive planet, raw and untouched. Or was it raw and untouched? Was it more like a corpse that had lain for years, waiting in the hope of a blessed or unblessed resurrection, as the case may be? Was it by the bones of a world? And were they some kind of parasitic life upon the bones? They didn't belong there. They weren't Colorians. He wondered if there ever had been any Colorians. Of course, they wouldn't have called themselves Colorians, Dan Jeffrey realized. That was just a name that one of the pioneers had given the place. Funny, he thought, the science fiction writers had started that trend years ago. Couldn't call a planet an ordinary sort of name. It didn't seem right. And the further afield you went, the stranger the name you found for it. You called them things like Kohler and Ashlam and Gazika without rhyme or reason, he thought. Funny how that tradition started. Things get called names for no real reason. He looked up at the rocket again. He recognized it this time. It was Fletcher Starbuck's rocket. Fletcher Starbuck, the administrator of the proto-colonists, the man in whose hands everything rested. If Fletcher Starbuck decided the planet was not suitable, he would put in a negative report and there the matter would end. If Fletcher Starbuck decided that the planet was suitable, he would put in a positive report, or he might put in a top priority positive report. In either case, it would be met with varying degrees of favor by what Big Dan Jeffries considered to be an extremely niggardly allocation council back on the Earth Federation planets. It seemed to him, when thinking of the Earth Federation, that the Martian and Venusian colonists had a powerful vote in the Federation. Martian and Venusian colonists who had been established for so long that they almost felt themselves to be homeworlds now. They had home rule. It seemed to Dan Jeffries that those colonists were the very people who were the cause of the trouble. They seemed so anxious to get every penny that Earth could spare, that the Federation had in the monetary fund, that they were reluctant to approve new worlds, and yet they seemed to be cutting their own throats to Jeffries because new worlds were what made a Federation grow vigorous, strong and powerful. You didn't get vigorous and strong and powerful if you weren't content with the same old worlds that you had had for 6 or 7 centuries. Then again, maybe he was imagining it. Maybe the Martian and Venusian colonists had an ingrained suspicion of colonization, of what it was all about. His thoughts were interrupted again. As he looked at the administrator's rocket, something was wrong. Something was definitely wrong. He had no idea what, because he was by no means an astronaut. He was an agriculturist. But he knew that something was misbehaving. The rocket was flying very erratically indeed. He cut off the motor of the big cultivating machine so that he could listen to the sound that the rocket was making. It dipped down even as he watched and seemed to be performing a series of weird somersaults. He didn't like the look of it at all. Fletcher Starbuck had a reputation amongst the colonists, a proud reputation. He was a man who always piloted his own craft, whether in an atmosphere or in space itself. The rocket that he was flying now was one that was used for short orbital journeys. Its range was very definitely restricted to the Sirian system. It would not have been capable of interstellar flight. It was also used for swift travel across the interplanetary surface through the atmosphere. Big Dan Jeffries assumed that Fletcher Starbuck had been intending to make a trip of a comparatively short distance, short so far as rockets went, from one side of the planet to the other. Possibly he had been intending to visit one of the small pro-colonial outposts on the other side, to see how the ploughing was going there, to see whether they had struck more or less snags than those which Big Dan Jeffries and his colleagues were encountering in their sector. But now as Dan watched the rocket, it didn't look as if Fletcher Starbuck was going to make that journey or any other ever again. The rocket was coming down, quite definitely coming down, spinning helplessly, hopelessly, haplessly, madly out of control. There was an awful crash. Jeffries felt the seat of the big mechanical cultivator vibrating beneath him as the ground heaved and pitched. Something deep within him seemed to say that he had seen the last flight of the administrator Starbuck. Chapter 2. Suicide? Big Dan Jeffries uncoupled the cultivating attachment from the back of his enormous tractor, engaged top gear, opened the powerful engine out as far as it would go, and raced back to his homestead. Inside the temporary, rather clumsy-looking building was a powerful radio transmitter. He got the transmitter going and made contact with headquarters. He was about 150 miles from the main sector of the colonists. The radio link, however, was a very strong one. The techniques of radio communication were pretty thoroughly advanced in the 30th century, anno domini. Jeffries told the story of the crash swiftly, succinctly, intelligently, and there was a startled gasp from the other end. The young lady receptionist was so tough in her way as Jeffries was in his, but now she sounded really startled, dismayed, incredulous. It wasn't the way proto-colonial women usually sounded. "You're sure?" Jeffries drew in a deep breath. "Sure, I'm sure. As sure as it's possible to be of anything on this damn crazy planet." "Thanks." There was a heavy sigh from the other end. "I'll get something going right away." "I'll keep on the air," said Jeffries. "It'll guide 'em in. The rocket's gone down about 4 or 5 miles from where I am now. I'll leave the transmitter on and get over there." But he knew as he spoke that it would be quite pointless. Leaving the heavy tractor where it was, he took a lighter vessel from its housing. This was a small single-seater hovercraft used for skimming across the surface of the planet. It had pretty obvious advantages over wheeled transport. If you are insulated from the surface of the planet by a cushion of air, there is very little likelihood of crashing through anything treacherous in the way of concealed water, quicksands, and the like. The 30th century hovercar was an ideal exploration vehicle. Big Dan skimmed across the intervening miles between his homestead and the crash in a matter of minutes. When he reached the scene, his heart sank. He had been hoping against hope that there might be some slim possibility of the administrator being alive, but the wreckage was strewn over a pretty wide area. He looked around for something that might give a clue to the cause of the disaster, but there was nothing. Nothing so far as his untrained eyes could tell. No doubt there would be things that were obvious to an expert, but as far as Big Dan was concerned, his field was agriculture, and the investigation in astronautical accidents was a specialized concern on its own. You knew your own field, and you knew it well. You knew more about it than your 20th century ancestors would have ever believed it was possible to know. He thought of other fields. He knew so little about them that other than their names and their general function, the rest was a closed book and a concealed mystery. Big Dan skimmed around the wreckage in his hovercraft, shook his head sadly, and made his way back towards his dwelling and the radio. There was, he reflected, little point in hanging around the wreckage. Suddenly he bit his lip as a thought struck him, rather unexpectedly. Dan was not a fast thinker. He was tough, rugged, and an individualist, but he was not a fast thinker. His mind usually came up with the right answer, but required more than the minimal time in which to do so. He had seen no sign of the administrator's body. The rocket had been very badly smashed and buckled, but there ought to have been some trace, he thought. Bodies don't just disintegrate. There had been no kind of burning. The rocket had been very badly smashed and buckled, but there ought to have been some trace, he thought. Bodies don't just disintegrate. There had been no kind of burning. He wondered whether to go back for another look, or whether to... He paused uncertainly. The hovercraft remained motionless a few feet above the ground. He had cut off the forward directional controls. On impulse, he swung the vehicle round and went back to examine the wreck. By the side of the ship, he saw a number of deep fissures in the earth. There were by no means any unusual phenomena on Kolar. Like the craters on the terrestrial moon, they were one of the things that man ultimately got used to. They were part of the terrain, part of the establishment almost. Funny though, he told himself, that the ship should have crashed so very close. Could it have been that the administrator's body had been flung clear and lost down a fissure? It seemed to go down to a hell of a depth, thought Big Dan. He stopped the hover car, climbed off, and went to examine the declivity. It was a hell of a depth. He decided again, several hundred feet. As he looked at the way the wreckage of the rocket had been strewn around, it seemed to make some kind of sense to him that maybe Fletcher Starbuck's body had gone down there. In that case, it would certainly never be seen again, he thought. There was neither the time nor the equipment to try to find a body in one of those fissures. Besides, it was quite possible that they could close up. Nobody was quite sure of it, one way or the other. There is a kind of fatal fascination which makes Homo sapiens look over the edge of deep crevices. There is a deadly lure that seems to draw us towards deep, dark places. They have about them a magnetic quality that is somehow both sinister and terrifying. It was that magnetic lure of the deep crevice that drove Big Dan Jeffries right to its edge. Lying absolutely flat, and yet feeling all the same that his head and shoulders must surely outweigh the rest of his body and topple him down to the depth, afraid. Even though he felt compelled, he kept on looking. Gradually his eyes got accustomed to the depths, and the darkness within the depth. Surely, he told himself, he couldn't see anything moving at the bottom there. Right down, God alone knew how far down. There were miracles and miracles. There were possible impossibilities and utterly impossible impossibilities. For a man to survive a rocket crash and to fall into a crevice like that must surely be the most impossible of all impossibilities. There had to be some kind of illusion to account for it, thought Big Dan. He thought he saw something move, but things don't move after they've fallen to the bottom of a 300-foot chasm. Maybe it was more, maybe it was 500. It was difficult to judge the depth accurately in a place like that. Slowly, reluctantly, Big Dan pushed himself back again, and as he did so there was a faint sound, distant, dim, far away. Blast! He swore out loud. Was that something moving? Or had he just pushed a pebble with his foot as he got away from the edge? Had he seen and heard something way down there? He went back and examined the wreckage, but search as he might, there was no trace of the mortal remains of Fletcher Starbuck. He must have been flung clear of his doomed rocket, thrown clear and precipitated down that dreadful abyss, decided the farmer. Big Dan continued his search until the first of the rescue rockets arrived. The girl on the switchboard had been as good as her word. She had got things moving. She had got things moving fast. She had got not only an orthodox routine search party organized, but she had seen to it that the biggest brass among the proto-colonists had been informed. After the administrator, the two most important men in the colony were the deputy administrator, Earl Walcott, and the chief of the IPF security forces, Glenn Bridger. The first of the rescue rockets that Big Dan saw was Bridger's official IPF security ship. She was fast and she was powerful. She was reliable and she was as space-worthy as it is possible for any spacecraft to be. In atmosphere or out of atmosphere, Bridger's big four-seater rocket was a pretty formidable piece of work. All the IPF rockets are. There was a high standards of maintenance in all IPF craft. Just as in the days of the 20th century back on Earth, and ever after, any police vehicle was an example to other road users as far as cleanliness, smartness, efficiency, and performance went. So the rockets of the Interplanetary Force, who were, administratively speaking, a cross between the United Nations and ordinary police organization, with a dash of Air Force and Space Fleet thrown in, so their craft were an example to other astronauts, cosmonauts, and aeronauts. The rocket touched down lightly and gracefully, easily. It was obviously being flown by masterly hands. As it touched down, the auto ramp slid out from the side. The lock opened silently and efficiently. IPF Chief Glenn Bridger stood framed in the aperture. Then he strode imperilously down the ramp, his shoulders as broad as the beryllium supports. His chest was massive, his great thick bull neck supporting a massive head, a great tough square head. He had a jaw like a steel trap, eyes like burning coals, thick, black, bushy, beating brows, and a heavy beard that framed his character-lined face. As he stepped down the ramp, a second figure emerged behind him, a slimmer, slighter, more academic and scholarly looking. This was Earl Walcott, the deputy administrator. Both men made their way to where Dan Jeffries stood amidst the wreckage of the administrator's craft. Bridger extended a colossal hand, and even Big Dan winced at the strength of that grip, for Glenn Bridger had the kind of grip that could crease an iron bar. "You sent the signal, I understand. It is Mr. Jeffries, isn't it? I believe we've met." Bridger's voice came up like an erupting volcano, came up like the boom of a gigantic bullfrog. It sounded like coal being shot out on a corrugated iron roof. It sounded like a ship's siren being played in slow motion. It seemed to set the wreckage vibrating again. Big Dan Jeffries had a deep voice, but compared to Bridger's, it was soprano. "I saw him come down," said Jeffries. "Can't understand it," replied Bridger. "Neither can I," put in Walcott. His voice was much lighter than Big Dan's. It sounded like a canary holding a conversation with a blackbird and a lion. "When you heard the three of them talking together." Just seemed to lose control of it, said Jeffries. Dreadful, murmured Walcott, simply dreadful. For some other deputy administrators that would have sounded hypocritical, but not from Earl Walcott. Whatever he might lack in stature, he made up in character. He would have liked the administrator's office. Naturally enough, every good red-blooded man wants promotion and has ambition, but if he had been told that the price of his promotion would be the death of his chief, he would have not had that promotion under any circumstances. He would have been glad to have been appointed administrator to a new world on his own, but he didn't want to take over from Fletcher Starbuck. Fletcher Starbuck was something of a legend among colonial administrators. He was one of the few colonial administrators who really got the full attention, and sometimes even the acquiescence of the Earth Federation when he spoke to it. "I can't believe it's happened," said Earl Walcott. "Why and how?" "Don't know till we've investigated, do we?" said the IPF man. "You say the rocket just suddenly seemed to lose control?" Big Dan was nodding. "Do you think he could have deliberately thrown it out of control?" "Deliberately?" questioned Jeffries. "That doesn't make any sense, Mr. Bridger." "I don't know," returned Bridger. "I just don't know. I can't think of any other reason." "Do you mean suicide?" "Well, if he was alone, yes, suicide." "He was certainly alone," said Walcott. "What makes you suggest suicide?" broke in Big Dan. "I should have thought Fletcher Starbuck was the last man." "Yes, very often that is what we do think about people until we find them stiff and stark. Strange but true, and all that sort of thing," said the police chief. He spoke cryptically, enigmatically. Earl Walcott looked at him knowingly, and realization dawned in his eyes. "You know something that we don't know, Glenn?" he said. "You've got some information that I haven't seen?" Big Dan Jeffries was forgotten. He was just a bystander now. "Maybe I do, and maybe I don't," answered Bridger. "You would never have suggested suicide otherwise." "You've got some inside information," said Walcott, half envyingly, half accusingly. "There is no body," remarked Big Dan, breaking in on them again. "Well, that's odd," rejoined the assistant administrator. "That's very odd." "Went down the crevice, I suppose," said the police chief. "I agree with you, Earl. It's odd. It's damnably odd. It's ruddy queer if you ask me. It's funny peculiar, not funny ha-ha." The chief of police and the deputy administrator lay prone beside the edge of the fissure as Dan had done. They looked down through the grey-black ash, and on either side of the fissure, down and down and down into almost immeasurable depths. Could be a mere few hundred feet, or could be 2,000 or 3,000 feet. Big Dan had been on the point of saying that he thought he had seen something move, but it sounded too incredible, so he shut up, forced the thought into his subconscious where it got suppressed. "It's a long way," said Walcott quietly. "You're telling me." "It's a hell of a way," said the police chief. Earl Walcott edged away from the fissure, stood up and brushed himself down. "Rather frightening," he said. "Yet I feel a strange fascination towards precipi. I don't know if that's the correct plural or whether one should say precipices." "It doesn't matter what you say. They're still strange magnetic places," answered the police officer. "Don't like 'em any more than you do, yet they have a strange fascination. Heights do the same thing for me. One gets the weird impulse to jump off or to throw something off. Maybe it's a subconscious desire for the spectacular. It may even be a subconscious memory from the days when man could fly, if you could believe some of the less orthodox anthropologists and evolutionists," said Walcott. "I've heard that at one period in our history, man had the power to fly at will." "I've also heard," said Bridger, "that those so-called dreams of flying have been caused by our memories of the days when we were fish. Yes, memories of the days before mankind left the water. The science of embryology points in the direction as well, said Walcott. But this information you had, what was it? I had an anonymous tip-off, which I am going to investigate as soon as we get back. Bridger spoke rather grimly. Walcott looked saddened and slightly surprised. I couldn't believe it of Starbuck, he said. Suicide, I mean, it's so unlike him. Another rocket touched down. Oh, here are my experts to have a look at the wreckage, said the police chief. I think we've done all we can do here. We're going back to pursue the other line of inquiry. Chapter 3. Evidence. Walcott and Bridger climbed back into the IPF chief's beautiful four-seater craft and sped back towards the headquarters of the Planetary Colonial Project. I suppose you realize, said the IPF man, as they climbed out, that this makes you the new planetary administrator. Yes, I suppose it does, pending either the confirmation of the appointment or a more experienced officer as a replacement, said Walcott. I think you'll get it, returned Bridger. He spoke rather prosaically, as though somehow the death of Fletcher Starbuck didn't matter very much. Walcott looked at him strangely. You seem to be taking all this very calmly, he said. I thought that you and the chief were pretty good pals. We were, said Bridger darkly. He put the emphasis on the were as though it was in the past, as though his friendship with the administrator was particularly in the past tense. Now that we're alone, I can show you this, he said, as they stepped into what had so recently been Starbuck's office. This was a small rectangle of paper. The deputy administrator took it from the police chief's hand and read it through carefully. My God, he said, can this be true? Well, we shall pretty soon know when we start going through his papers, said Bridger grimly, and there was such depth and purpose in his voice that it rattled the paperweight on the desk. I can't believe it, said Walcott. I can't believe that Fletcher would be that kind of man. Well, according to the writer of this anonymous missive, said the police chief, holding it up, he was not only that kind of man, but he was being blackmailed for it. He was being blackmailed for betraying the trust that the Federation had placed in him, that the colonists had placed in him. But misappropriation on so grand a scale, and those other charges, well, they need not all necessarily be true, but obviously one or other of them is. Otherwise, why the suicide? Said Bridger, and now the anger and the bitterness in his voice was very obvious. I feel he was betrayed me more than anybody else, said the police chief. We were so very close, such friends, had been for years. We were at school together, at college together. He said he did his IPF conscription at the same 2 years that I did. I signed on and he went into the admin service. Once or twice our paths crossed for long periods. On 3 occasions in the past we were posted to the same proto-colonial development, and on 2 out of 3 of those occasions Starbuck was able to solve problems that would have beaten a lesser administrator, and I was proud to be there helping him. Why would a man like that throw away a career for the sake of appropriation of planetary funds? Damn it, he got his administrator's salary. I can't understand it. He wasn't a gambler. He had no women trouble. He wasn't an alcoholic. He got none of the weaknesses that usually lead to misappropriation on a grand scale. It can't have been greed. He was ambitious, yes. Most strong men are ambitious. Julius Caesar was ambitious. Well, if so, said Walcott whimsically, 'twere a grievous fault, and grievously hath Caesar answered it. Oh, I see, you know your Shakespeare well, boomed the bullfrog voice of the IPF chief. He heaved a deep sigh. When you had trusted a man as he had trusted Fletcher Starbuck, and he lets you down not once but twice, when your entire judgment of him is swayed beyond reasonable belief, you feel as if you're treading on a hollow world, and your feet are going through it. I knew Starbuck as well as I thought it was possible to know any other human being. We were more like brothers, and then, repeated the police chief with even more bitterness, sadness, and disillusionment in his voice. He does two things which I would have laughed out of court if anybody had said Fletcher Starbuck could penetrate either of them. The first, he looked up at the ceiling again as though for inspiration. This misappropriation. The second, suicide. I would have said that Fletcher Starbuck had more principle and more courage than most men put together. By these two actions, he has apparently proved that he has very little principle and very little courage. I think I could have forgiven him the misappropriation, but the suicide, I don't know. I find that harder to sympathize with. I'm inclined to agree with you, said Earl Walcott, but perhaps we don't know the full facts, Glenn. Perhaps there is more to this than meets the eye. Fletcher was more than my chief, he was my friend. Well, I would say much the same thing, agreed the IPF man. He was my friend too. That's what makes it hurt so much. It's like having a red-hot knife plunged into your back. It isn't the knife that hurts, but thinking it's your friend Brutus who did it. Back to Shakespeare, said Walcott. Yes, back to Shakespeare, said the police chief. I wish we were anywhere but where we are now. I could face a lot of things more easily than I could face this. Of all the tough things on a tough planet, it's the kind of thing that bites a man's soul from his body and spits out the pieces like pips. Oh, Starbuck, how could you do it? He looked up at the ceiling again as though seeking to find the answer written there on the blank white surface. He sat there at the desk and rolled his head on his hands. Starbuck, he whispered again. How could you do it, Starbuck? Walcott put a hand on the police chief's shoulder. Well, maybe there is more to it, he said. Maybe the evidence isn't evidence. Bridger straightened himself up. Evidence is evidence, he said. Look at it in this way. It adds up for me. Much as I liked Fletcher, I can't pretend even for his sake that 2 and 2 are 3 or 5 or anything except 4. He sighed again. And what do the facts say? He asked himself rhetorically. Walcott looked at him sadly. An anonymous document, he said. An anonymous document reaches you and accuses the chief of misappropriation, and also admits that he is being blackmailed. Who do you think sent it? Asked the force chief. Walcott shook his head, but Bridger had not been expecting an answer. It was not the kind of question that can be answered at that stage of the investigations anyway. Big Glenn Bridger was talking to himself as he paced up and down what had been Fletcher's office. It's odd, he said. If I blackmailed the administrator of the whole colonial project because he was misappropriating funds, I wouldn't write to the police chief telling him what I was doing. Yes, you would, said Walcott. You would in one circumstance. Bridger snapped his fingers. If he had called my bluff and threatened to stop a paying, he exclaimed. But would I also admit my blackmail in the same letter? You might, said Walcott, if you were a certain type of criminal. Do you believe in criminal types? Asked the police chief with a smile. I grew out of that after my first 10 years in the force, but I'd like to hear your theory just the same. Well, whether you agree with the principle on which I base the theory, I think you must agree, said Walcott, that the theory has some shreds of evidence in its support. I'll be able to tell you that better when I've heard it, said the IPF man with a grin. He had not been able to grin since they had got the message over the radio to the effect that the administrator's plane had come down. It was not a very long-lived grin. It died stillborn. It was an abortive sort of grin. If you were the kind of criminal who likes to pride himself on thinking that he has got away with something, explained the deputy administrator, I think we ought to change jobs, said Bridger. I'll take over the admin, and you can come and look after the IPF and the security. That seems pretty obvious, you know. Well, maybe I'm still too stunned, he went on, about what happened to the chief that I just can't make myself think straight. If he was being blackmailed by a blackmailer who was proud of the fact that he couldn't be caught, who, like Jack the Ripper, took a delight in writing to the police, telling them where and when he was going to do his next job, if we can believe those old records. Yes, indeed, said Walcott. A conceited blackmailer who lets you know the hold he has over his victim and also admits that he's been blackmailing him. You know, I still can't get the hang of this, said the police chief. I would have thought from all I knew of Fletcher Starbuck that if anybody had tried to blackmail him, he would have killed rather than pay a penny. He was that kind of man. I remember him once saying something like that, said Walcott. I think we were just discussing crime in general, and the way that we do discuss crime politics, the weather, sport, just one of those things. He paused and scratched his head. Yes, I'm positive. I can hear him saying it again in my memory. I can remember him saying that if anybody ever blackmailed him, he'd kill them in cold blood and thoroughly enjoy doing it. He said it was the most despicable of all crimes because it drives the victim into a kind of mental agony and despair. He said he wouldn't even let it start. That makes it all the more interesting and odd, remarked the police chief. I'm coming round to your point of view now. I'm beginning to wonder if there is more in this than meets the eye. It's difficult, damn difficult. The evidence all seems so cut and dried. It seems just a bit too cut and dried, rejoined his companion. Chapter 4. The Warning. That afternoon, as IPF Chief Glenn Bridger sat mulling through a sheaf of reports that had come in from the various colonial outposts during the last 24 hours, he was suddenly startled by a crash, and showers of transparent plastic that had once been the window rattled on the desk all around him. There was a dull thud as an object landed on the floor at his feet. It was a gleaming round metallic object, and the police chief flung himself flat on the floor, on the opposite side of the thick, heavy laminated plastic desk, but there was no explosion. He counted to 10 and then 20, still no explosion. Gingerly he got to his feet and peered at the object carefully over the top of the desk. It was not smoking or ticking. That, he decided, was a good sign, but it didn't necessarily mean that the object was safe, though it certainly pointed in that direction. IBF Chief Glenn Bridger was a cautious man, but he was no coward. He was cautious, as it is true to say that a commando saper is cautious when he dismantles the enemy mines. He was cautious in the same way that a frogman is cautious when he is fixing sticky bombs to the sides of enemy shipping, or when he is setting a submarine charge, working mainly by touch in the deep blue depths of the ocean. That is the dictionary definition of the word caution. It is not caution of the type that ordinary men in less hazardous occupations understand. It is the skilled care of fearless man doing a dangerous job thoroughly, because fearless men, like ordinary men, cling to life with understandable tenacity. Because an explosive expert is not afraid of an explosion, he still handles it with an intelligent modicum of respect. Experience now told the police chief that if the projectile that had just crashed in through his window had been a bomb, it was 10 to 1 that it would have already gone off. It had not gone off, ergo logic seemed to decree that it was not a bomb. On the other hand, if it was not a bomb, what the blazes was it? Gingerly, Bridger moved round the desk, extended a hand and picked it up. It was perfectly cool and very light, too light to contain an explosive. He heaved a sigh of relief, for even when you feel that there is a 10 to 1 in your favor against an object being of an explosive nature, it is very nice when the last possibility is also concluded in your favor. Even a 10 to 1 chance of being blown up is more of a chance than most of us like to take. As Bridger moved the little cylindrical canister, for such it now appeared to be, there was the sound of folded paper moving inside it. A message, he decided. At that moment the door opened and the duty sergeant appeared. "I thought I heard some sort of disturbance in here, sir. Are you all right?" He broke off short when his eyes fell on the shattered plastic pane. "Yes, I'm none the worse for a fright," replied the IPF chief. "Some neurotic colonist has decided that the postal service is inadequate and sends me a message through the window in one of this sorts of bomb case." "It looked like an explosive to me, sir, at first," said the sergeant as he peered again in the metallic cylinder which Glen Bridger held. "Looks very much like an explosive," went on the sergeant. "It's not," said Bridger. "It's too light. Feel it, man, feel it." The sergeant extended his hand rather more gingerly than Bridger had done. "It won't bite you," said the IPF chief. "It's as light as a feather. There's nothing in there capable of exploding with any violence." As the sergeant shifted the cylinder around in his hand, he flashed an intelligent glance at his chief. "You're right, sir. About a message, I mean. It sounds like loose paper shifting around in there. Folded paper." "Exactly what I thought," agreed Glen. "The question is, how do we undo it?" "There's some tools in my hovercraft, sir," said the sergeant. "Shall I fetch 'em?" "Yes. I should think 2 pairs of pliers would be the answer to this, to get a grip on each end." "It either pulls out or unscrews," said Bridger. By the time the sergeant had returned with the 2 pairs of pliers, they were superfluous. Using nothing but his great hands, Bridger had already forced the cylinder halves apart. He was examining the folded paper which it had contained. Bridger had already forced the cylinders halves apart. He was examining the folded paper which it had contained. The sergeant slipped the pliers into his pocket rather disappointedly. "You won't need these now, sir," he said. No, said Bridger absently. The chief's concentration on one job at a time was legendary among all those members of the IPF who had ever served under him. It was said that if you could catch IPF Chief Bridger in the right mood, say, "Would you sign this, sir?" and pass a 3 weeks leave pass under his nose, he would very likely sign it with a smile and not realize till afterwards what he had done. But because of Bridger's reputation as a disciplinarian, nobody played those kinds of tricks. Like a famous politician before him, Bridger believed that the one thing he was doing at that one particular moment was the most important thing in the world, due to the faculty of concentration that he had had. Even a simpler job like tying his shoes or doing his hair, even something he could do inside and out and back to front like driving his hovercraft or flying his rocket ship, he did each thing with the full power of his concentration behind it. And Glen Bridger's concentration was absolutely superlative. At last he looked up. His brows were creased thoughtfully as he passed the sheet across to the sergeant. "It's a warning," he said at last. But now the sergeant was preoccupied with what he was reading. Bridger began pacing around his office. He was a great pacer, Glen Bridger. It helped him to think. It helped him to concentrate. Not that his concentration needed any particular help. "It is very odd," he said. "A warning from a man who was obviously very intelligent and knowledgeable that the radiation level is about to be increased. The background radiation will be up to danger level. Now, in the first place," he looked at the sergeant, "how the hell can anybody know a thing like that? In the second place, why warn me in such an odd, anonymous manner? It seems pointless, absolutely pointless. Why warn us? Why?" "Do you think it's just a crank trying to pull off a hoax?" asked the sergeant. "No, I don't," returned Bridger. "In the first place, look at the words and the phrasing that man uses. He's obviously a highly educated man. He's no crank. This is no hoax. In the second place, whoever delivered that through the window took a chance, a big chance. If he'd been spotted, there'd been big trouble. In fact, if any of the men on guard outside the building had seen him preparing to throw a metallic object through the window of the building, you know what that would have meant, don't you?" "He'd have been shot," said the sergeant promptly. "Probably shot dead. I wonder how those outside guards missed him." "Well, although our system is good, it's not infallible." "There's no such thing as an infallible system," agreed the chief. "Still, I'd like to know how they missed him. All the same, go and find out, will you, Sarge, whether anybody saw anything at all out there. In the meantime, tell the radio operator to get me through to the admin building. I want to speak to Mr. Earl Walcott." "Yes, sir. Certainly, sir. At once, sir," said the sergeant. The IPF chief picked up the radio telephone as soon as the indicator flashed to show that his call was through. "Earl," he said, "I have just received—" Before he could finish, Walcott broke in excitedly. "Not you too, Glenn," he said. "You mean you've had one?" "Well, let's stop talking in riddles," said Walcott. "What I've had is what I thought was an assassination attempt, but it turned out to be a message. An anonymous message warning me that the radiation level is going up sharply." "That's precisely what I've had," said the police chief. "Has anybody else had one? Do you know, Mr. Administrator?" He deliberately used the phrase Mr. Administrator, not Mr. Assistant Administrator. If Walcott noticed, he made no comment. "I don't know of anyone else who's had one," he replied, "but that doesn't preclude the possibility. It's only just arrived." "Yes, so is mine. I wonder which of us got ours first." The police chief was working out the distance between his own office and the admin building. "What time did you get yours?" "Oh, about 6 minutes ago, I would say, judging by the clock," said the new administrator. "Then you got yours first," replied the police chief. "I wonder whether our cylinder postman is doing a round, or whether he considers that you and I are enough." A sudden thought came to Bridger. "Why didn't you call me before, as soon as it happened, I mean?" "Too busy," said Walcott. He didn't say it unkindly. "Too busy?" asked the police chief. "What do you mean?" "I mean I had to act on the emergency. I am in the process of sending out alarms." "You're taking it seriously, then," said the police chief. "I'm glad to hear it, very glad. Well, I don't know if our messages were the same, but mine contained some pretty convincing technical detail." "There wasn't much of that nature in mine," replied the police chief. "It just said that the radiation level was going up, above the safety margin, and that we must take precautions if we're to save lives." "You don't recognize the writing, I suppose?" inquired Walcott. "Well, I don't know. I did think it looked just vaguely familiar, but the familiarity was so vague as to be of no use at all." "Same here," agreed the new administrator. He sighed. "Queer," he said. "Very, very queer." "Do you think there is any chance that it is a hoax?" asked the police chief after a short pause. "I was going to ask you that question," said Walcott. "I was rather hoping it might prove to be so." "Hope and fact are poles apart," said Bridger. At that moment the sergeant returned. "One of the men outside, sir, said that he saw someone opposite your window, about 150 yards away on the other side of the clearing." 150 yards? Exclaimed the chief. Good God, man, nobody could throw a thing 150 yards. It was the only person who has been anywhere near the building at all, sir, said the sergeant. 150 yards? Bridger bit his lip thoughtfully and crashed one great fist into the palm of the other hand. That's damn queer, even queerer than the message. Look, Sergeant, I want you to send out an all stations call. This is in support of an administrator order, already sent from the top. Warn all citizens to stand by and take immediate radiation precautions. They are to be kept informed. I want protective clothing issued to all the men, by the way. You and I had better get some out of the store as well. I want Geiger counters and all the other protective gear, and we'll stand by for a Grade A emergency. Right, sir, said the sergeant, and hurried out to comply with his chief's instructions. Chapter 5. Radiations and Weather. Glenn Bridger was big enough when not enveloped in a protective suit, but in a protective suit he looked really gargantuan. He was a powerful man, and like many other powerful men, with the possible exception of such literary heroes as Bulldog Drummond, who was one of the few big men who could move with grace, silence, and absolute dexterity. IPF chief Glenn Bridger was a little bit inclined to be on the clumsy and cumbersome side. This tendency was accentuated by the suit that he now wore as he made his way rapidly across the administrator's building. He didn't feel odd or out of place in the suit for the simple reason that everyone else was wearing one too. It was, he reflected, the wisdom of Fletcher Starbuck that had seen to it that the expedition had been fully equipped with suits in case just such a radiation emergency should arise. Some of the colonists had grumbled, some of the big business interests, in fact, who had helped to finance the expedition of exploration in the first place, had considered that they ought to take more agricultural and mining equipment, more surveying gear, and far less in the way of protective clothing. Big business had argued that it was better to work on a narrow safety margin and a wide profit margin, rather than vice versa. But Administrator Fletcher Starbuck had been quite adamant, and big business had been told precisely where it got off. As he thought over these facts, the facts which has now proved absolutely invaluable as a lifesaver, the IPF chief began having other thoughts about what had happened to the administrator. The suicide and misappropriation of funds seemed now like part of some ridiculous nightmare. Would a man like Fletcher Starbuck, who stuck out against all that was worst in big business in the 30th century, stuck out for human life and human safety, stuck out against greed and avarice, could Fletcher Starbuck have possibly sold himself out? Or was that supposed stand which he had made on behalf of the safety margin and the protective suits all part of the hypocrisy? That would have made it 1,000 times worse. Was it? Could it be? No, thought Glenn Bridger. Surely he hadn't got to add this hellish hypocrisy to his late lamented friend's other faults. Fletcher Starbuck just couldn't be that bad. It hurts the chief's pride, surely. He couldn't have misjudged Fletcher Starbuck to that extent. His thoughts were cut short by his arrival at the admin building. The door creaked open slowly. A junior member of admin staff, also clad in a protective suit, ushered him into the new downstairs office, for it had been more than Earl Walcott could stand to keep using his predecessor's equipment. Everything in that room had Starbuck written all over it. Everything in that administrator's office had been so much a part of his own character, had been so much a part of him as his own flesh and blood. It was like using a dead man's nose, ears, mouth, eyes, and fingers to use Fletcher Starbuck's equipment, and it was more than Walcott could stand. He and Starbuck had been such very close friends. The police chief, too, was glad to be in another office. Everything upstairs sang too loudly of Starbuck. Every Starbuck memory had a question mark tied to it as far as the IPF man was concerned. The radiation certainly came up to expectation and more, said Walcott cheerfully, almost conversationally. He said it with the air of a man who, having predicted a disaster or having acted upon someone else's conviction of a disaster, is glad rather than disappointed when the disaster takes place. Some of the terrible psychosis war is tied up with that attitude. When a nation has sold to itself the idea that war is inevitable, war very often becomes inevitable for that very reason. Men who think war beget war. The few sane individuals who think peace often have the greatest difficulty in generating it, because they are so outnumbered by the morass of don't cares, the quagmire of don't knows, and the hysterical desire of a powerful section of public opinion, or of the leaders, perhaps of public opinion, to plunge into yet another cataclysm. In his mind, Walcott went back over the wars that history had recorded. 2850, Mars versus Venus. 2817, Mars versus Earth. 2780, Earth versus Venus. 2612, Earth and Mars versus Venus. 2590, Mars and Venus versus Earth. 2471, attack from outside the system by weird beings called Lurkars, an abortive attack. Fortunately for the Lurkars, had been far from pleasant and far from numerous. It was as though a small detachment of them had drifted as far as the solar system almost accidentally. It was not a pleasant picture that his historical recollections painted in his mind. As man's technology had advanced, so his standard of civilization, and certainly his standard of civilized behavior, seemed to have retrogressed. Maybe at long last he had learnt. But if anything, thought Walcott, wars seem to have been growing more frequent during the last few centuries than less frequent. Maybe one of these days some damn fool would make a mistake and unleash a bomb of such magnitude that he didn't like to think about what would happen then. But it had to be thought about. He was a man, not an ostrich. He didn't like burying his head in sand or in black volcanic ash, if it was volcanic ash. There was a difference of opinion about that. Some of them said it was the historian's province. Some of them said it wasn't. Some said that the atomic physicists ought to look at it. The atomic physicists were pretty busy in other directions. The colonists hadn't been on Kolar long enough to do any serious investigation. Walcott snapped his mind away from the train of thought very rapidly and looked back at the IPF chief. Before he could speak, the radio telephone on his desk jarred suddenly. "What the devil?" jerked Walcott. "Nerves must be getting bad," grinned Bridger. Walcott picked up the radio telephone, picked it up clumsily, and adjusted the visor of his suit so that he could both hear and speak without permitting too much of the radiation to penetrate. "This is the administrator's office." As he listened to Walcott speaking, Bridger was aware of the fact that he didn't say, "This is the administrator speaking." He still used the stock phrase, "This is the administrator's office." Maybe it was modesty, decided Bridger. Maybe it was a deep-seated refusal to admit that Fletcher Starbuck really was dead. The shattered plane and the crevice in the side of the grey-black mound beside which it had crashed seemed to tell their own bitter tale, and yet, thought the police chief, suicide, misappropriation, those things just did not ring true with a man like Fletcher Starbuck. His mind came back to the radio telephone conversation, which was taking place a few feet away from him. Behind the adjusted visor, Earl Walcott's face suddenly blanched, and casting a swift, meaningful glance at the police chief, he turned up the volume of the radiophone receiver so that Bridger was able to hear as well. The voice at the other end was faint, muffled, and distorted, as though it were being deliberately disguised, and yet, just like that strange handwriting, it had about it a peculiar familiarity. There was a very peculiar familiarity about this voice. Only just here and there did something seem to ring a bell, an intonation, a tiny part of a small syllable, yet it was nothing definite, nothing you could put your finger on, nothing you could use as evidence, nothing you could build a hunch on, never mind a theory. "I'm glad that you heeded my warning regarding the radiation," said the voice. "I hope that no lives will be lost now that you have taken these sensible precautions. Things would have been very bad otherwise. I do not believe that the radiation will last indefinitely. We will hope that it will subside, but there are other dangers." "What other dangers?" asked Earl Walcott breathlessly. "Thank you very much for the warning about the radiation, whoever you are." There was a pause, as though the listener was digesting the information, as though a mind at the other end was carefully considering the administrator's words. "Who are you?" persisted Walcott. "I cannot say," came the voice again. "Cannot or will not?" inquired Walcott. "Is there a difference?" asked the voice. "But we waste time. Beware of the weather, particularly beware of the wind. Tell all your people to take hurricane precautions immediately. But another word of warning. Your precautions should not be too obvious, and if you wish to receive any more warnings when disaster threatens, do not make them public. Just give orders. Say nothing about the warnings." "Huh?" said Walcott incredulously. "I don't get that, I'm sorry." But there was silence from the other end. "I wish the communication here was the audiovisual technique, where you could see your correspondent as well as hear him," grumbled the police chief. There was something about that voice that was familiar. There was something familiar about the handwriting on that other warning, said Walcott. But what? "Don't know," grunted Bridger. "But like you, it's puzzling me. Are you going to do anything about this hurricane warning?" "You bet your sweet life I am," said Walcott. "The administrator's prime duty is to protect the lives of his colonists, of his pioneers. Earth Federation doesn't treat its pioneers as well as it should, but it doesn't like to have them destroyed. It realizes, however badly it may treat them, and to whichever words they may go, proto-colonists are the cream of the solar system. Without colonists, there'd be no expansion. Without expansion, there'd be economic stagnation, and economic stagnation would strangle the entire Federation. But this isn't the time for a lecture on economics. This is the time to get a hurricane warning out." He started issuing orders rapidly to a staff who had just finished ensuring that all the anti-radiation precautions were being put into effect. There was some weary signs from some of the communication officers, but they got on with the job magnificently. Chapter 6. Fire and Flood. Bridger and Walcott had been without sleep for 48 hours. Behind their protective clothing, both men were lined of face and red of eye, not to say short of temper. "This is absolutely incredible," commented Bridger. "Incredible's not the word. It's absolutely fantastic, Glenn," returned Walcott. "I just don't understand it. I don't understand it at all. Look at the things that have been happening to us. First of all, the terrific rise in the radiation level over almost the entire surface of the planet. God alone knows what caused it. Geiger counters everywhere going mad, everybody in protective clothing or trying to get down below the surface out of the way of the stuff. It was just as if vast deposits of radioactive material suddenly came to life again. It was as if there were eruptions of some kind of short-life radioactive gas. I just don't know how to describe it. The nuclear physicists are still working on it, and they haven't gotten very far." "I agree with you," said his companion. "It's absolutely incredible. If the nuclear physicists can't work it out, I don't suppose we shall be able to." "That hurricane," put in Walcott, "it would have killed nearly every colonist on the planet. It went around like a mad thing." "There was more than one, but our Met stations being out of action, we couldn't do much about tracking," said the police chief. "The whole atmosphere seemed to come alive as though having a life and death battle. It was over almost as soon as it started. If it hadn't been for the warnings, the radiation in the hurricane could have left a trail of dead colonists so big that we could never have sorted out the middle, the muddle, and never known what was what. As it is, we haven't heard of a single life being lost yet, though property has been destroyed in plenty. It's going to set our property back 3 months." "It's the crops that I'm chiefly worried about," said Walcott. "The majority of that stuff is pretty well irreplaceable. What the radiation didn't poison, the hurricanes dealt with. Our chief problem soon will be an alternative food supply." "And these warnings," said the police chief, "these warnings, I can't get a clear pattern to emerge. Everything seems somehow senseless. It's as though we were fighting a schizophrenic." The radiophone crackled again, but this time it wasn't a voice. It was Morse, old-fashioned but still very widely used even in the 30th century. Nothing more reliable or more suitable had ever been devised. Both Walcott and the IPF chief knew it very well indeed. It had been part of their basic training in their conscription days, and now the memories, dim at first, came pouring back. The dots and dashes buzzing over the radiophone made coherent sense, began making a lot of coherent sense. IPF chief and administrator looked at one another. "Another warning?" said Bridger. Walcott nodded as Bridger produced a pen and started scribbling down the letters as they came out. His original surmise had been correct. His mental translation of the Morse had been right on the button. It was indeed another warning. It was simply 3 words, 12 letters spelled out over and over again. FIREAND FLOOD. Fire and flood. Fire and flood. Then the message changed. The Morse took a new series. TAKE PRECAUTIONS AS SECRETLY AS POSSIBLE AS POSSIBLE. Take precautions as secretly as possible. Over and over, and then suddenly, silence. 2 weary, exhausted men, police chief and colonial chief, stared at one another. "Can it be true?" asked Bridger. "It was true on the last 2 occasions, unfortunately," said Walcott. "There is no more need to doubt this than to doubt the last 2. In fact, the more verification we get in the shape of disasters, the more one is inclined to be credulous rather than otherwise." "Yes, experience of veracity increases credulity. I would agree," said his companion. The 2 men were silent, staring at each other from behind the visors of their suits. "You look pretty, well, all in," said Walcott. "I was just going to say the same to you," rejoined the IPF man. He felt a surge of the kind of fellow feeling that men experience when they have shared hardship together long beyond the limits of human endurance. These 2 men had been organizing the radiation protection of an entire planet, and so far it had paid off. They had organized the hurricane defense, and that had paid off. And now, when flesh and blood were screaming out for sleep, when aching limbs were crying for rest, when aching bones were calling out for respite, there was another warning. "Oh, come on," said Walcott. "We've got work to do." The police chief nodded. "That's my boy," he said. Rank formality, these things meant nothing to an emergency. The situation was stripped down to the basic fact, and the basic fact was that two able, capable, dedicated men were doing a tough job, and doing it damned well. That was the fact of the situation. Whether one was the IPF chief and the other one was the administrator made little difference. They were different edges of the same axe. They were the complementary halves of the steel curves that made up the point of the dagger that was penetrating the problem that confronted them. Walcott, slim, dapper, brilliant academician, contrasting strongly with the square-headed, bull-necked, mightily built IPF chief, yet for all Walcott's dapperness and slightness of build, he was not a man entirely devoid of physical strength, stamina and power. In fact, his stamina in many ways and his powers of endurance were almost the equivalent of those of the gigantic IPF chief. And although the leader of the IPF had won more renown by his physical brawn, the ability to shoot straight, and his lion-like courage than he had on account of his academic virtues, he was nevertheless no fool. He was certainly no dunderhead. A man does not get to be an IPF chief unless he has more than bone or vacuum inside his cranium. It was quite possible that Glenn Bridger would never write a dissertation upon progressive relativity or etheric Melbar radiations, but he had sound, practical, very compensatory common sense. In fact, he had so much of it that it was almost uncommon sense. "What precautions do you take against fire and flood?" asked Walcott suddenly. Bridger raised one eyebrow, one tired, grimy eyebrow, and shook his head slowly. "The basic precautions for the two would be very different," he said. "It also depends on what sort of fire we've got to fight and what sort of flood it's going to be." They had a sudden quick example of what sort of fire it was going to be. Just outside the admin building there was a rumble and a crack. After the rumble there was a terrible silence. Suddenly, after the terrible silence, a tremendous uprush of flame, smoke, soot, grime, and then an indescribable burning smell. A smell of something very horrible being incinerated very rapidly at great heat. The police chief and the administrator looked through the window at the erupting earth. Great tongues of flame licked and billowed out of the aperture. "That fissure wasn't there a few minutes ago," said the administrator. "I'm certain of it." "It's there now," said the police chief, "and it's advertising its presence pretty effectively too, isn't it?" "The thing that amazes me about you," said Walcott, raising his visor and wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief that was rapidly approaching blackness. "The thing that amazes me about you," he repeated, "is the way you make these confounded jokes in the most unfunny situations. You realize that the whole blasted admin building is probably going up any minute, and you talk quite calmly about the flame coming up through the fissure as if it was the 5th of November. Maybe it is back on Earth. The date systems don't coincide," smiled Bridger. "There you go again," said Walcott. "Quite incorrigible." But he said it with a twinkle in his voice as well as in his eye. He replaced his visor and checked the Geiger counter as they went towards the door. "Well, whatever other hell is popping out here, I think the radiation level is beginning to subside a little. I think we've weathered that storm." "Yes, but the storm has certainly done its job though, hasn't it?" reminded the IPF man. "As far as the crops are concerned, I mean. As we remarked before, what hasn't been poisoned by radiation has been blasted flat by the hurricane, and now it looks as if What fragment has survived is going to get burnt to a cinder. Firefighting teams were arriving as though by magic. Proto-colonists usually like to stick with their colony. They will fight against unbelievable odds to establish and hold a hard-fought claim to a few square miles of rock, miscellaneous chemicals and what have you. Kohler was not everybody's idea of an ideal planet, but it might, by the very slimmest and slenderest and barest of possibilities, hold within its strange confines untold mineral wealth. There might be heaven alone knew what hidden beneath those mounds. It was not unknown in the history of the Federation for sites that were apparently of only primitive archaeological interest to reveal the remains of civilizations which had been parallel cultures of equal development to the earth before they managed to destroy themselves. They had come across several ruined cities before. Most nations usually developed the atomic bomb before they developed a sufficient degree of civilization which to control it. Many a nation on many a planet, humanoid and non-humanoid, had apparently discovered how to blow itself to pieces and its neighbors along with it, before they had discovered how to love those neighbors sufficiently not to want to blow them to pieces. Firefighting teams go to work on the fire in the fissure, shoveling in dry stone dust, pouring in enormous quantities of water from a nearby river. Somebody had the brilliant idea of blasting a watercourse from the level of the river down to the fissures below it, for the river at that point ran high through alluvial banks. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of water plummeted down into the fissure. It was a spectacular sight to watch the enormous mass of steam erupting all around the administrative building. The administrator and the IPF chief left the firefighters to it and blasted off to make a quick survey in the IPF man's rocket, the beautifully built four-seater. "Will she weather it out if we hit a hurricane?" asked the administrator. The IPF chief nodded. "Hope so," he said rather cryptically. Walcott hoped so too. Hoped so very fervently. They flew on. Below them they saw one fissure after another, often those that were closest to the grey-black mushroom ruins. If they were ruins, the grey-black mushroom mounds, fissures erupting with flame and smoke, fissures erupting with clouds of thick black poisonous-looking gas. The whole planet seemed to be erupting at once. Grimly, the big IPF chief pushed the rocket onwards towards the planetary equator, the Kohler equator. Over the south they crossed and on towards the southern pole, flying at extremely rapid rate. The craft was designated to do a comfortable 2,000 miles an hour in atmosphere. On and on they sped, and everywhere below them things were the same. Every fissure that seemed capable of erupting was erupting. Smoke, flame, clouds of grime, soot-like substances were flying high into the air, and everywhere teams of firefighting colonists were diverting the nearest water supply, getting it into the fissure, and the flame and the smoke were giving way to steam and explosive splodges of hot mud, and finally, reluctantly, flames were going out. Whole rivers were diverted into newly blasted channels by desperate colonists struggling to save their fragmentary crops. The heat surrounded the fissures was enormous, and the same protective clothing that had stood the men in good stead against the radiation menace was now protecting them against the danger of the heat from the fissures. The IPF chief was weighing facts upon his mind as he flew over the nightmarish scene. First, he told himself there had been that crazy 1,000,000-to-1 freak accident which Big Dan Jeffries had reported, that crazy 1,000,000-to-1 freak accident in which the administrator had apparently committed suicide, and his body had disappeared down one of those fissures. After that, a series of strange warnings, and then radiation, hurricane, and now fire and flood. There must be a link somewhere, the way in which that first message had been delivered. Nobody could throw anything 150 yards. Not by hand, they couldn't. And then suddenly something very odd sprang back into the police chief's memory. Among his other hobbies, Fletcher Starbuck had collected ancient weapons, and one of those things that was the pride of his collection was an old-fashioned humanoid rifle, the kind of thing that had been used in the two great wars of the 20th century, a thing that fired a grenade by a device, as far as the police chief could remember, called a ballistite cartridge. A grenade had been placed on the end, and a blank cartridge had been exploded, which had ejected it and thrown it a considerable distance. He was not terribly clear about how the old firearms had worked. He himself had been brought up on energy blasters, and the thought of using explosive powder and a solid projectile seemed a bit odd, as alien to him as the boomerang or the bow and arrow. But he knew that such device as the one he had remembered seeing in the collection of Fletcher Starbuck would have been quite capable of firing that little metal projectile 150 yards, throwing it with great accuracy and precision right through his window. He thought hard about the matter and decided to check on it when he got back. If they got back. He decided as yet another sheet of flame erupted not far ahead of them, and then he became aware of a new peril. Further to their left, he saw a tidal wave racing towards the distant coastline, for Kolar, although not a tremendously watery planet, did nevertheless possess smallish inland seas. The tidal wave was as nothing compared to tidal waves of gigantic magnitude which Bridger had seen in the Atlantic back on Earth, but it was nevertheless big enough and devastating enough to do tremendous damage. Warning had been radioed to expect fire and flood, but Bridger wondered whether the men would be so concerned with fighting the fire that they would not notice the flood until it was too late. He pointed dramatically towards the racing tidal wave, and Walcott seized the radiophone urgently, pushing back his visor. He snarled into it. "Tidal wave. Calling on general wavelength. Abandon firefighting positions and stand by with anything that will float. There is an enormous tidal wave crashing inland now. It will be in striking along the southern shores of oceans in the southern hemisphere. Whether the effect is the same in the north, we cannot yet tell." A report came in from a northern patrolman. "Exactly opposite effect in northern hemisphere, sir. Tidal waves striking north, depth 12 to 14 feet. "Thanks," said Walcott, and radioed back to admin headquarters. "Keep that going on general transmission," he said. "Yes, sir," came a voice, and then their ears were filled with a fresh warning as the wary firefighters, still tired from battling with hurricanes, wearied by the weight of their radiation clothing, stood by to battle with yet another of nature's marvels. Chapter 7. The Volcano. The tidal waves had struck and done their worst. There were a few acres of crops scattered in sheltered ground, which had been able to escape the ravages of radiation, the fury of the fires, the holocaust of the hurricanes, but they had been pretty well obliterated by the flood water, which had fallen almost as rapidly as it had risen. It contained not only the familiar sodium chloride of earthly oceans, but harsh alien chemicals in solution, chemicals which were deadly anathema to the carefully imported, preserved and guarded plant life, which the colonists cultivated so desperately in order to keep their footing on this recalcitrant planet. Big Dan Jeffries sat astride a hastily constructed raft. Most of the others had been able to get their hovercraft, but Big Dan had been a fair distance away from his when he had seen the tidal wave coming. His raft had been constructed from the timbers of a nearby building, It had been that or drown. He knew it would have been suicidal to try and make a race for his hovercraft against the floodwater. He would have been submerged long before he reached it. He had barely had time to tear down thick, heavy planking at the side of the shed, to clutch hold with his iron-hard muscles, lash his belt to one of the outstanding timber struts, and to hold on for dear life as the floodwater took in on crazy surfboard run, swirling it up and over and round and down. Somehow, now that the worst shock of the wave was over, Big Dan felt strangely calm and at ease. His mind felt an unusual kind of peace. He felt now, he thought now, he was convinced now that the planet had done pretty well everything it could. His crops had all gone. Radiation, hurricane, fire, flood, one series of disasters after another. It didn't make sense. It was a run of such incredibly bad luck that it couldn't be just luck. There had been something deliberate behind it. Nothing like this had happened since the colonists had been on Kolar. They had been there long enough, surely, to know whether this was likely to happen. The Met men had no indication of it, and there was no apparent reason for any of it, thought Dan. Why? His mind became filled with unanswerable question marks. He tried to ponder the imponderable. He tried to answer the unanswerable. He tried to believe the unbelievable and to comprehend the incomprehensible. The result of these valiant mental efforts was a headache, so he lay back on the raft and relaxed. There was nothing else he could do. Time passed. The raft continued to bob gently on the receding floodwaters. Suddenly he noticed a series of larger waves that were causing the floodwaters to more violently gain. He gritted his teeth and hung on. Oh hell, he thought, here comes another tidal wave. He wondered whether his partially disintegrated building timber raft would be capable of standing the strain. He hoped that it would. If it wouldn't, he knew that he wouldn't either. There was no high land within reasonable sight, certainly none that he could paddle to, and then suddenly, as if from out of nowhere, land appeared. Hot, steaming land, a great wedge of it, suddenly ramming its way up out of the sea like a vast subterranean mole, throwing up the ocean bed as it built itself a submarine tunnel. "What the devil?" said Big Dan, to no one in particular. And the raft and the water in general. "What the devil?" he repeated. More smoke, more steam, a very similar phenomena to that which had erupted at the base of the fissures with which the planetary surface was covered. The flood, thought Dan, at any rate, had satisfactorily put out the fires into the fissures, and there was more smoke, more steam, more movement of the ocean, and more shock waves of the waters striking at the raft. He clung to it tightly now, more tightly than before, trying not only to hold on, but to hold the errant timbers together. And then Big Dan Jeffries' eyes opened in amazement, and something that might have been akin to fear in a lesser man. But Dan Jeffries was not a man to recognize fear, although what he saw now caused even his stout heart to miss a beat. After all the natural perils that he had already overcome, the mountains circumvented, here was something new. Here was terror with a capital T, fear with a capital F, horror with a capital H. Here was nature at her most violent and her most terrible. Here was something besides which the hurricane and the smoking fissures paled into comparative insignificance. Here was something that made the tidal wave in its fury look like the lappings of the gentle wavelets around the feet of the wide old Canute. Now here before his eyes, a gigantic volcanic island was being thrust upon from the depths of God and the devil alone knew where. Higher it rose, and higher still, and with a tremendous reverberating explosion, the top was blown off it in a series of sundering sparks and showers of sundering, shattering, scattering fragments. Big Dan Jeffries closed his eyes and hung on for dear life. Huge portions of volcanic lava and ash hurtled down into the sea beside him. Pieces of white, hot, smoking, steaming rock were like fragments of an exploding champagne cork of some rare vintage that has fermented since the dawn of time in the cellars of the timeless gods. Every time the great rocks, some weighing hundreds of tons, struck the sea, the raft bobbing up and down and great clouds of steam hissed and sang and spat about Big Dan's ears. He was not particularly a religious man. He was not above all things a pious man. He believed, as most men believed, in a great power at the back of creation. He believed that the power was basically good rather than evil, no matter what happened to him. And in his own simple way, rough diamond that he was, he tried occasionally, when he remembered, to worship that power, to give it the reverence and the homage that he had felt it was due. He didn't really like to go so far as to call it God, but he believed if the power had a name and a personality, then that personality could be summed up in those 3 dynamic letters. He prayed now. He prayed to the power that he believed was there, to the mercy that he believed was there, and somehow his prayer was answered, for the falling rocks missed his raft by fractions, and though the raft trembled and shook and threatened to split at every new impact, somehow it held together, and somehow Big Dan held onto it. The volcanic mound grew higher and higher and higher, but the shock waves were carrying him gradually further and further away from it. Yet so rapid was its growth that despite the increase in the distance, as far as observation went, to Big Dan Jeffries, the volcanic island seemed to maintain a consistent size, even though he knew that he was leaving it quite rapidly, for the waves and the current were moving him fairly fast in the opposite direction. "Seen everything now," he muttered to the raft. "I've seen absolutely everything." Chapter 8. The Ghosts of Kohler. The tidal wave had gone completely, and the flood water it had brought with it had drained away, mainly into the great fissures. The fires in the fissures were out, the radiation was back almost to normal, the hurricanes had blown themselves to pieces, the volcano had ceased to erupt. A kind of strange, uneasy peace hung over the shattered planet. Big Dan's raft grounded gently on soggy earth, soggy soil, soggy ground. He stepped gingerly over the side and sank in up to his knees, but below that it seemed pretty firm. There was a foul smell everywhere, a smell of dead animals, dead fish, a smell of decaying plants. Dan knew that pretty soon there'd be an epidemic of something or other. If there was an epidemic, the best place to be is where you can get the first-class medical attention, and that was at Colonial Headquarters. All he needed now was somebody in a hovercraft to come and rescue him, somebody in a rocket to touch down and pick him up and then blast off again. He longed desperately to see some sign of human habitation, but his little homestead had been quite a fair way distant. As he stood on the soggy ground, still keeping a weather eye on the raft in case he should need it again in a hurry, he turned things over in his mind. The rocket crash, the disappearance of the body of Fletcher Starbuck, apparently down the fissure, the arrival of the 2 chief men in the colony, Glenn Bridger and Earl Walcott. Then all that strange talk about suicide. It didn't make any sense to Big Dan Jeffries. Fletcher Starbuck just wasn't the kind of man to commit suicide. Yet all the evidence of the crash seemed to have pointed that way. Then, all these natural disasters, radiations, hurricanes, fire, flood, volcanoes. On every occasion, except the appearance of the volcano, he had some kind of warning over the radio. Somehow it seemed that the administration officers were aware of the disasters shortly before they happened. How could they be aware of them? Big Dan had no idea. But the warnings which had been broadcast from the admin building without apparent rhyme or reason or explanation as to the source of the warning had definitely saved him 2 or 3 occasions from certain death. He would not have been aware of the radiation had he not received that warning of the radiophone. He would not have been able to dig in against the hurricane. He would not have known that the flood was coming. As it was, the flood warning had been a bit late, still better late than never. It had just given time to get to the building. Perhaps those few vital seconds had made all the difference between life and death. He had been told to look out for the tidal wave a few seconds before seeing it. He squelched away under the mud, thinking hard. Squelching around in mud, he decided, was not particularly conducive to thought, but there was little else he could do except sit on the raft, and he was getting corns through sitting. He had sat on the raft long enough. As the water continued to subside, more and more land appeared. He saw something moving a few hundred yards away to his left. It looked like a hovercraft. He waved his arms violently and shouted. No response. He unfastened his belt, tied it to his raft, and towed the already battered timbers across his squelchy mud. He was taking no chances on losing that raft until he was quite sure that there was no danger of reoccurrence of flooding. He reached the spot where he thought he had seen movement. The hover car, if it was a hover car, had now disappeared into the distance. But on the muddy land where he had seen a flurry of action was a container, a very big container. Curiously, he opened it. It was quite dry, so there had been someone or something there. Then he realized what it was. It was a food container. There was an ample supply of bread. He got to work on the bread ravenously, for it was only then he realized quite how hungry he was. As he began to gradually allay the worst of the hunger pangs, it occurred to him that there was a slightly odd taste about the bread, but maybe he was imagining it. He had been through so much during the last few hours that he was quite capable of imagining anything, he decided. Shortly afterwards, lashing himself to the raft with his belt and wedging it as securely as he could in the mud, he fell asleep beside the big rectangular food container from which he had eaten the bread. When he awoke, it was pitch dark, dark as the pit, dark as the tomb, dark as the grave, a thick black velvet darkness that seemed almost tangible in its intensity. The kind of darkness that got into the pores of your nose, the kind of darkness, decided Big Dan Jeffries, that went creeping into a man's ears like the poison in the ears of Hamlet's father in that ancient play from distant earth. Thick, black, tactile darkness. He coughed and spluttered as though trying to spit the darkness out. The darkness didn't seem to want to be spat out. It continued, filling his nose and mouth and ears. At last he forced himself to realize the purely psychological character of the darkness. Having done that, he was a step nearer to success, a step nearer to the kind of mental victory that enabled him to overcome it. At last, he forced himself to realize the purely psychological character of the darkness. Having done that, he was a step nearer to success, a step nearer to the kind of mental victory that enabled him to overcome it. A line of the ancient holy book of earth went through his mind, the book that had been read and translated into nearly every language on earth, and every language of every known intellect with whom the humanoids of earth had come into contact. The book that Earthmen had taken with them to every planet they visited, colonized or conquered. The words were in the Gospel of St. John in that book. And the light shone in the darkness, and the darkness could not overcome the light. He repeated them to himself out loud. Somehow it helped to dispel the unutterable gloom, the impenetrable gloom. He thought about the light of one tiny candle shining in a great world of darkness, and he knew that one tiny candle could not be extinguished. Old-fashioned as the candle was, the colonists knew all about old-fashioned improvisations. In many ways, colonists were closer to 20th century man and even medieval man than they were to their own 30th century, because when colonists equipped themselves and that equipment broke down, they had to make do as best they could, and very often make do was an extremely primitive affair. Man is versatile, whether it be in the 3rd century, the 13th century, the 23rd century, or the 30th. Man is and always will be versatile. Therein lies the secret of his survival. Without his versatility, he is nothing, but with it he becomes a potential universe conqueror. Big Dan Jeffries sat up, staring. There was something in the darkness ahead of him, something moving. "Hello?" he shouted. "Help! I'm over here!" The thing started moving towards him, and then he saw it. It wasn't what he had expected. It was tall, 8, maybe 10 feet tall, broad, frighteningly broad, broad in proportion. It had a great red and blue head, huge yellow eyes, gigantic sparkling green horns, and claws that extended like knife blades. "No!" screamed Jeffries. "Get away! Get away!" Even as he watched, the thing began to change. It grew legs, dozens of legs, and thousands of arms. It resembled a gigantic sea anemone, gliding along, looking at him with huge yellow eyes. No, they weren't yellow, they were red now. Now they were black, blacker even than the darkness. Now the whole thing was glowing with light. Now it was just a sort of transitory pattern in the darkness. And now it wasn't anything. Now there wasn't anything there. He saw a snake, a huge skeletal snake moving towards him like a herringbone pattern come to life. A gigantic pterodactyl in vivid green, blue, and red spots came towards him out of the tactile darkness of the coal iron night. Dan Jeffries covered his head with his hands and slumped onto the raft. The raft was moving beneath him. Even though his eyes were closed, he could see a huge mole-like creature down in the earth, and mud and slime below him. A huge mole-like creature with gigantic jaws ripping up the mud and throwing the raft about. Suddenly, Big Dan was aware there was a witch-like creature, humanoid in some respects, and yet with a nose and chin out of all proportion and with ghastly yellow fang-like teeth. The witch had seized him somewhere around the body, and try as he would, he could not throw her off. He felt an agonizing pain in the stomach, and then he was violently sick. That seemed more real than any of the other things that he had seen. After he had been sick, he felt a little better, but the pain and the weakness was still there. He remembered the bread that he had had, a devilishly odd flavor. Was there some connection? His mind was too pain-racked to enable him to think clearly. Out of the darkness he saw more moving lights. He closed his eyes, but this time the lights disappeared when he closed his eyes. He opened them again, and the lights were back. He could see the green and blue, horny creature apparently fighting with the sea anemone over who was to have possession of him, but the lights were shining through them. Something deep down within him tried to tell him that the lights were real and that the other creatures were not. But if they weren't real, then what the devil were they? and what had been wrong with the bread that he had eaten. The lights came nearer, and suddenly a voice called, "Dan, is that you? Dan Jeffries." "Yes," he managed to blurt out. "For God's sake, help me." The lights were mounted on a powerful hovercraft, a big one. Not the little one-man skimmers that the colonists used, but a big official one. Sitting in the bow was IPF Chief Glenn Bridger and a rescue party. There were several other colonists wrapped in warm blankets in the back. Big Dan was lifted aboard by the powerful sinews of Glenn Bridger. Dan collapsed on the floor, and the big purple thing with bright eyes and huge teeth subsided into a nightmare that gave place to a dreamless but broken sleep. Suddenly, Big Dan was sitting upright again. "I can see them," he panted hoarsely. "They're coming! Thousands of them! Look, look!" Bridger, startled, handed the controls to his sergeant and came over to Big Dan. "What can you see?" he asked quietly. "Ghosts," said Big Dan. "Thousands of them! An army of them!" Another phrase of scripture came oddly to his lips. "A multitude no man can number. The dead are coming. Ghosts, the ghosts of Kolar." Then he slumped unconscious into Bridger's arms again. "He's pretty seriously ill," said Bridger to the sergeant. "What do you think it is?" "Well, I'm no medical man," said the sergeant, "but I have got an idea." Chapter 9. Orbit 1. The big IPF chief laid Dan Jeffries gently on the floor of the hovercraft, made his head comfortable with a pillow, and turned swiftly to the sergeant. "You know what it is?" he asked. "What do you think it is?" "Well, sir, I think it's ergotine poisoning." "Ergotine poisoning?" exclaimed the IPF chief. "Ah, yes. Suddenly memory came flooding back, memories of outbreaks in medieval times, outbreaks even as late as the 20th, 21st, and 22nd centuries, apparently. Unexplained happenings in various places, people who thought they had seen visions, ghosts, monsters, zombies, werewolves, all kinds of incredible phenomena. All these things could be traced to ergotine poison. A strange fungus attacks bread and produces a drug. All those things now clicked into place in the security chief's mind. "I believe you're right, Sergeant," he said. He looked swiftly through the medical manual. At first he found no mention of ergotine or any kind of antidote. "It's so rare it's not in the blasted manual," he said. "Try miscellaneous poisons, it might be under there," said the sergeant helpfully. "Yes, I will," answered his chief. "Thanks." He went through the manual again, the manual with which every hovercraft medical chest was equipped. "Got it," he said. "Here it is. It comes under the PX-194 group of antidotes. We'll try it anyway." He took the ampoule of PX-194, broke it carefully, and prepared a syringe. A dab of sterilizing fluid on Big Dan's arm, and then PX-194 fluid was carefully injected. 5 minutes later, Big Dan opened his eyes. "God," he said, "that feels better." He sounded much more like his old natural self. "What the hell happened?" he asked. "Those things I saw, it's good to see you, Mr. Bridger, very good to see you. So you found me on the raft then? I'm a bit confused still. Those things, they're not real, are they? Those coloured things with claws? That thing that got hold of my stomach. I still feel sick." He leant over the side of the hovercar and was sick. "That feels better still," he said as he came and sat down again beside the police chief. "Have you eaten anything since these disasters began?" asked Bridger. Dawning suspicion mounted in Big Dan's mind. "Why, yes, I did," he said, puzzled. I saw someone moving around and thought it was a rescue party from the hovercraft. I shouted and waved to them, but they didn't stop. They didn't appear to see me. Nothing happened, so I took my belt off, towed the raft behind me, and made my way across to the spot where I thought I'd see them. When I got there, there was a big food container. I opened it, and it was full of bread, the sort of thing you'd think naturally a rescue party would bring around. I thought maybe they'd seen me, seen that I was alive and kicking, and just left me a food container as near as they could, waited until I'd seen them and waved, and then made off again to some other poor devil. Time is vital in these rescue operations. But didn't it occur to you, said the chief, that no genuine rescue party would leave a survivor with just a case of bread? Why, you might have been injured. Surely they would have stopped. I didn't think about it at that time, said Dan, except that I thought it seemed a little bit queer, and I was damn disappointed when they pulled off without me. But you know how it is. I was exhausted and my mind wasn't working very clearly. Yes, I can understand that, agreed the chief. Very few of us have had any sleep for days. It seems an eternity since I got even a half-hour nap. I keep thinking of feathered beds and anti-grav cushions, all the kind of luxuries that a tired man thinks of when all he wants to do is sink down into blissful repose. Even the thought of it is sweet. He shrugged his shoulders and fought off the mood. Right, he said suddenly, briskly, in a businesslike matter-of-fact tone. So, you ate some of this bread, naturally enough, being hungry, not having had any food for many hours? It seems like days, weeks, months, said Dan. I've got a pretty big frame here, and it feels that I've had nothing inside it since Pontius was a pilot. I feel I haven't had a square meal since God made little apples. The IPF chief grinned at the colonists' humour. So, you poke this bread into you as ravenously as it's possible for a hungry man to eat, and then... Well, then I guess I must have gone to sleep, said Dan. I don't remember much else except waking up in the pitch dark and thinking it had never been so dark, never. And then out of the darkness I saw things, monsters in fantastic colours, claws, teeth, hands, eyes, the lot. Real science fiction type bug-eyed monsters, things like you only see on those covers of really sensational books or advertising video programs back on Earth, you know? Yes, I can imagine, said the IPF chief grimly. So can I, sir, said the sergeant. How come you were so quick to think of ergotine? I'm not really sure, sir. My grandfather picked up a dose of it when he was doing some exploring with a colonial trip. He often told me about it when I was a kid. I see. That's probably why then. Very few people have had experience of it in these modern hygienic days. I don't think things are so modern and hygienic out on a colony run, are they? No, that's very true, agreed the IPF officer, nodding approvingly towards his sergeant. He's a good man, Dan. He got on the track of what it was. You've got him to thank as much as anybody. What did you do for me? Could you fix me up all right? This bread, I'm still foggy, said Big Dan. Well, said Bridger, the bread was either deliberately or accidentally treated with ergotine. Now, we certainly didn't drop it in the container for you, and we were the only official rescue craft in this area, which can only mean one thing, Dan, that another link has been forged in a very mysterious chain of circumstances. Jeffries plied the security chief with questions, but Bridger would say no more, and when Glenn Bridger chose to be silent, he could teach clams and oysters quite a lot about their profession. But for all his silence, his mind was a seething mass of activity. Perhaps by direct contrast with his absence of speech, He was thinking like a machine gun. Thought was following thought in various logical sequences until it seemed that he would either come up with a solution of some kind, a working hypothesis, or else his head would burst in the attempt. When Bridger got one of these moods, and albeit they were fairly rare, for he was a physical rather than an intellectual type, there was no stopping him, and like Sherlock Holmes scrapping away on his old violin, Bridger just got lost in a mood of deepest possible concentration. He would think and think and think again, sometimes in machine gun-like spates as he was doing now, sometimes long, slow, soliloquy-like thought processions, but no matter how he thought, he continued to hammer at a problem till something gave way. There had to be a connection, he told himself, between the disappearance of the administrator, the strange warnings that had come, the warning that had been projected by means of a ballistic cartridge, of a type which would very easily have gone with a gun that had belonged to the late administrator's collection, if he was late. A suicide that didn't make sense, misappropriation of funds, or the apparent misappropriation of funds, the blackmailer's letter that had led him to think that his old friend, Fletcher Starbuck, had been other than he believed him to be. There was evidence which was not evidence. There was facts which were not facts. There were clues which were not clues. A fantastic mental muddle, a phantasmagoria of thoughts winged swiftly through his mind. They were followed by frenzied thoughts, and they in turn by quiet, placid, but nevertheless penetrating thoughts. The next thing that occupied his mind was the strange chain of natural disasters, the fire, the flood, the hurricane, the lot. Somebody, he reflected, must have a reason for wanting to get the colonists off the planet. Could that somebody have any connection with the apparent suicide of the ex-director, the ex-administrator? If so, where was who or what was behind that desire? Who could possibly want to get them off an uninhabited planet, and why? There were apparently no life forms left here at all. They had discovered nothing apart from one or two very lowly animal specimens, just a few simple mammalian life forms, little pink animals, rather like pigs that scuttled about, well clear of the colonists. There were a few fish in the small inland seas, but not much in the way of life at all. Those dark areas might once have been the cities of an intelligent race, but if so, ages ago that race had blown itself to smithereens. They surely couldn't want the planet back. What about the next planet? Thought the IPF chief suddenly, and the thoughts suddenly sang out in harmony in his mind. What about the next planet? He said it out loud this time. What was that? Asked Big Dan. I said, what about the next planet? Repeated the IPF man. I was speaking my thoughts out loud. You go back to sleep, Dan. Said Big Dan and rolled over. He said, once more, and then all that could be heard from him was a series of gentle, undulating snores. The IPF chief smiled. He knew how much Dan deserved that sleep after what he had been through, but there was no sleep for Glenn Bridger. Glenn Bridger's active mind was flogging him on, like Simon Legree applying a whip to a recalcitrant cotton picker. It was very quiet aboard the hovercraft as they skimmed over the boggy plain that had been left behind by the receding floodwaters. Very, very quiet indeed. Only sounds were the quiet purr of the motors, the soft, sibilant noise of the jets, of the air cushion that held them up. They were speeding back towards admin, headquarters and police headquarters, and so Glenn continued to think. He thought again about the next planet, their nearest neighbor, in space apart from the two weird moons which were even now rising. His thoughts were interrupted by the appearance of the moons. One reflected a powerful yellow glare, and the other an almost equally violent blue glare. They rose at different angles, and their orbits were far from similar, yet wherever their light crossed, the yellow light and the blue light faded into strange shadows of pale green. It was a most weird and wonderful effect. Anyone walking in that light found himself with a pair of different colored shadows walking along beside him at different angles. From being an entertaining experience at first, after a time it became an irritation, a confusion, a nuisance and an annoyance. The more Glenn Bridger thought about Orbit 1, the more convinced he became that here lay the sources of the fantastic series of nightmare and natural catastrophes that had overtaken Kolar. He knew well that there were no life forms here on Kolar in Orbit 2, but if on the innermost planet of Sirius was some kind of intelligent life, perhaps a life form, which although quite technologically advanced in some respects, was not up to the humanoid standard in others, that did not want to have humanoid colonists establishing themselves to trade, and sooner or later to explore. Nobody had as yet visited the world in Orbit 1. It hadn't been named. Orbit 2 had seemed the most Earth-like planet, so that was the one they had got on with first. Bridger decided that Orbit 1 would have to have a visit. Chapter 10. Blast Off. Glenn Bridger sat in the administrator's office talking to Earl Walcott. He was outlining his plan or theory, if anything so amorphous as the ideas in Bridger's mind could be called a plan or a theory. "Take this whole aspect of the crash again," he said. Walcott nodded. "It doesn't seem to make sense. We knew that, as far as servicing went, as far as technical security goes, there could have been nothing mechanically wrong with Starbuck's ship. According to Dan Jeffries' account, it seemed to get out of control as if it hadn't been deliberately thrown into a stall, as if, well, to put it bluntly, as if Fletcher had deliberately forgotten about the controls or just slammed everything into the wrong position, like a man who drives his car into a tree deliberately for the sake of the insurance money. Neither of those things makes sense." "How was Fletcher's health?" asked Walcott. "Oh, very good as far as I know. What did you think?" "I'd be inclined to agree with you," said Walcott. "I don't think there was anything the matter with him. I mean, nothing that would cause a sudden blackout or anything of that nature. Nothing that would cause him to slump over the controls and press the wrong button or pull the wrong lever or turn the wrong flap. No, I'm sure there wasn't. He wasn't the sort of man to subject to giddiness or anything of that nature." "Then what the hell is it?" demanded Walcott. "Well, it's a mystery," replied the IPF chief. "That's all there is to say about it. It's just a mystery. There's no means of knowing what caused that crash. The only thing we do know about it is that there was something very peculiar, something very odd, something that shouldn't have been. And then this whole possibility of suicide," went on Walcott. "I suppose that fits into your thinking?" "Well, yes, it does indeed," returned the IPF chief. "You see, it doesn't seem to make any sense to me. It was so completely unlike Fletcher. It was so completely un-Starbuck-in, if you see what I mean." "I do indeed," said Walcott. "I see very clearly. And this so-called evidence, this piece of paper, purporting to come from a blackmailer, well, that's—" "You don't suppose," said Earl Walcott, as a sudden strange inspiration struck him. "You don't suppose that—" No, that's impossible." "What's impossible?" demanded Glenn. You don't suppose he could have sent the thing himself, do you? Sent it himself? That's incredible. And yet, I don't know. But to what purpose? Why? There was a bewildered silence as both men thought out the implications of that one. You mean that all this apparent misappropriation wasn't misappropriation at all? I just don't know, said Earl Walcott. But everything ties in. Well, I agree with you there, returned the IPF man. Everything must tie in. Somewhere along the line there has to be a link. There has to be a common denominator. Somewhere in this jumble of threads there has to be one strand which holds the solution. Somewhere we've missed the continuity. Somewhere somebody is trying to get this planet made uninhabitable. Someone is trying to get this proto-colonial expedition made into a dismal failure. I don't know. I have no idea of the motive or of the identification of those behind the motive. These warnings, said Walcott suddenly, where do they come in? Why set out to try to destroy a planet and at the same time warn the people that you're trying to destroy? It doesn't make any kind of sense. That's ludicrous. That's like sticking a man up with a toy gun and then saying this isn't really loaded, you know, so you don't need to be frightened. It's quite pointless. Do you honestly mean to say, asked Glenn, that you think that series of disasters was caused and that whoever knew they were going to be caused sent a warning, that the very man who started them warned us about them? But why? How could a man do that? You can't create whirlwinds and hurricanes and floods on that scale. You can't, returned Walcott, and I can't, but that doesn't mean nobody can. I mean, a moron with an IQ of under 80 would not be capable of comprehending Einstein's theory of relativity, but you could, and I could. I see what you mean, answered the police chief. You mean there may be some alien culture, some extra humanoid culture, something beyond us, bigger than us, from somewhere outside. We've met alien creatures before, reminded Walcott. We've colonized planets on which an alien culture has coexisted. Sometimes they've resented us a bit. Yes, the police chief sounded thoughtful. We have come across races composed of what we would call pure thought. Etheric races, yes, said the police chief again. He added. The monosyllable was vibrant with meaning. He said again. He was thinking deeply. What was I going to say before you started showing me these new angles? Was the possibility that there's no apparent life on this planet other than ourselves and the few simple flora and fauna that we have already encountered? Could it be that it's the next door neighbors that don't particularly want us? You mean Orbit 1? Asked Walcott. It hasn't been visited, of course. If there was a culture there which was capable of these things, and these kinds of technical maneuvers, and they didn't want us to inhabit Kolar here in Orbit 2, then, well, there's a possibility that it is the cause of the trouble. They could be sneaking in and setting these disturbances off and going. Let's fit the other half of the theory, said Glenn Bridger, snapping his fingers. Put me in the picture. I'm not quite with you, asked Walcott. If they were technologically advanced and reasonably civilized, they might want us out, but they might not particularly want to kill us. You see, they might not be barbaric, even though they are ruthless. I don't call it ruthless to warn a man. I should have thought that the quickest way to get us off was to kill a few of us. Yes, but they may not want to do that. They may be mixtures, just as Human beings are mixtures, good and bad. They want us out for what are to them logical reasons. Yes, that's the point. They warn us to prevent any bloodshed and then demonstrate to us how impracticable it is to try and live on this planet. Got a point there. There was another long, thoughtful silence. Finally, the administrator said, "I think I'll come with you." But Glenn Bridger shook his head. "It isn't that I don't want you. I'd be glad of your company, but you realize that there's no deputy administrator. You haven't got a natural and logical successor like Fletcher had. The place would relapse into complete and utter chaos if anything had happened to you." "How do you mean?" asked Walcott. "I mean that if there is something or someone hostile on the planet in Orbit 1, and if I don't get back, it won't matter such a devil of a lot. There is a deputy IPF chief, but we've already used our emergency administrator, so to speak, in the form of your good self. If anything happens to you, the administration of this planet is going to crumble, and any hope at all of the proto-colonists had of establishing anything in the way of permanency fades until it becomes infinitesimal. The chances shrink below zero." "Well, if you put it that way," said Earl Walcott, "I suppose I've got no choice but to stay here." There was a moment of deep quiet. "Well, just in case then," said the IPF chief, and the two old friends shook hands. It was with mixed feeling that Glenn Bridger made his way to the launching pad, upon which he normally stored his big 4-seater space and atmosphere craft. He called at IPF headquarters and picked up some heavy arms. It was probably an unnecessary precaution, he told himself. Orbit 1 was more likely to be deserted than Orbit 2, but much more likely. He made sure that protective clothing, atmosphere and pressure suits were included. He made sure that the rocket was adequately fueled, and he picked up 3 men who had volunteered. They blasted off, headed for Orbit 1. The computer man rattled off a course. It was only a short course, and a particularly easy one to calculate. It could have been done without a computer, but habit is habit. Regulations are regulations. A man has a method of doing a job, and he does it according to the method. They were on course, and there were no hazards in the intervening void. Sirius, huge and bright, made it necessary to close the observation screen filters, and then the computer and the automatic instruments told them that they were coming into Orbit 1. They prepared for touchdown, and Glenn Bridger wondered whether he would find the solution to his problem here, or whether this was just a wild goose chase. Chapter 11. Touchdown. The landing they made was quite uneventful. 30th century space technology had seen to it that landings were uneventful in almost every circumstance. Only a fool or a would-be suicide could crash a rocket in normal peacetime conditions. They were not, of course, absolutely foolproof. They were not suicide-proof, and they were certainly not war-proof. But given equal chances and normal landing environments, the humanoid space and atmosphere craft were pretty satisfactory. They were very adaptable and very fast, and in time of war they could carry a redoubtable armament. The planet, as far as they could see through the observation port, now that the shutters were drawn back, seemed to be bare and arid, the kind of world they had expected it to be. Most Orbit 1 planets are barren and unfertile. Life has not had a chance to develop in the intensity of the radiation which falls most heavily upon the planet that is nearest to the star around which it revolves. In our own solar system, thought Glenn Bridger, Mercury never had a chance to develop any kind of life. It was just the bleached bones of a world. He put out the necessary probe devices. Radiation was high. but a little below danger level. It was not the sort of world that could be colonized, but one could live there for a short time, at any rate. Temperature would make life unendurable without a suit. He communicated the information to the 3 men who had accompanied him. They began making preparations accordingly. He sampled the atmosphere. Not that it mattered very much, because they would have to wear suits to protect them against the heat. And even if the atmosphere was breathable, it would be so hot that it would be a lung scorcher. They would have to use suits and their own atmosphere. Had it been cooler, Bridger decided from the sampling tube when it came back, then it might just have been breathable. It was rather thin. He threw out the gravity tester and watched the height of the balance against the scale. It was half a G. It was 1/2 Earth normal. That would make progress easy without making it so easy that it would be dangerous to overstep yourself. He liked walking around on planets with half-normal gravity. By the time that they had offset the encumbrance of the suit, it would be very similar to the feeling that you get when you wake up on a bright spring morning and the whole world seems good and green and fair. And because every muscle, sinew and nerve, every blood vessel and every organ is perfectly in tune and working magnificently, you feel 10 years younger. Life is very definitely worth living, and there is a zest and sparkle in the air. It was that kind of feeling that a man got in reduced gravity. His step was springier and lighter. It eased the strain on the heart, on the leg muscles, on the body as a whole. It was good, very good, to move around in reduced gravity, provided that the gravity was not reduced to such an extent that it became dangerous, and an ordinary step would carry you 40 feet and bash you into a sharp rock edge. It was odd, thought Bridger, that most of the reduced gravity worlds were so deficient in atmosphere that you had to wear a suit. It was, of course, the very lack of gravity which resulted in the thinness of the atmosphere. He was fully aware of that, but it did seem that it was rather tantalizing that on the kind of world where you could skip and gambol about like a young spring lamb, you had to wear a suit. But this was no time, he decided, to go off in a long train of philosophical speculation. This was a time to get some action. He had come there to solve a problem, a specific problem. And the problem was, did this strange, arid planet in Orbit 1 hold the solution to the mystery of the series of natural disasters that were threatening to drive the colonists of Kohler in Orbit 2? Glenn Bridger made sure that all suits, equipment and atmosphere tanks had been carefully checked. The refrigeration suit was working perfectly, and he decompressed the ship as a final safety precaution. Intercoms crackled into life as the 4 men got into radio contact. "All okay?" asked Bridger. There was a chorus of "All okay, Chief." Then Glenn led his little party through the lock, down the ramp, and out on the surface of the planet in Orbit 1. It was powdery to the feet, very similar to the surface of Earth's Luna, but not quite so dusty. The thin, hot atmosphere picked up whirls and eddies of the dust as the men moved across. Here and there across the surface were great fissures and cracks, heat-bleached craters, rocks that shimmered in the powerful Syrian light. They walked for a mile in every direction. They did a big circuit of the ship, keeping it constantly in sight. There was nothing to be seen except that same desert aridity that they had already observed. It appeared to be everywhere. "There doesn't seem to be anything here," remarked Bridger. "Not a thing, sir," answered the sergeant. They went back to the ship. "We'd better do an atmosphere cruise," said Bridger. He depressurized the cabin and they took off their suits. Then they did a long, slow atmosphere cruise right across the planet. There was nothing but rocks and dust, More rocks, more dust. Fissures, cracks, crevices, small mountain ranges shimmering in the heat. No sign of vegetation, no sign of animal life. It was hot and dead. "There's nothing here unless they all live underground," said Bridger. "What do you think, Sergeant?" No sign of any ventilation shafts, no sign of anything that could indicate underground development. "No, sir," agreed the sergeant. "I think we're wasting our time," said Bridger. "It just seemed a good idea, that was all. Where the devil are these things coming from? Where the devil are these natural disasters originating? If somebody wants us off Kola, they've got to be operating from somewhere. I wish I could find some kind of answer. I wish to heaven I could find an answer." "Don't think we're going to find one out here," said the sergeant. "Neither do I," agreed Bridger. "This has been a waste of time, a complete and utter wild goose chase. Never mind, there's nothing like bought wit. If you don't buy it too dear, as they used to say. Well, let's get back." They turned the ship at right angles to the planet's surface and blasted off. The great space rockets took over from the atmosphere jets, and the powerful, lightning-fast four-seated raced like a streak of silver light back towards Kola in orbit 2. Chapter 12. Argument. Bridger had scarcely blasted off before Walcott found himself with two rather unwelcome visitors. As administrator, he tried to be impartial. As assistant administrator, he had tried to be impartial. He always prided himself that he was a fairly easy man to get along with, but there was some people with whom it was just impossible to get along, and two of them had just invaded his office. Clayton and Prosa were two of the most unpleasant characters who had ever annoyed a planet by their presence. They were both fat. They were more than fat, they were obese. They smoked cigars. They were bald and sweaty. They looked like a nightmare version of Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Unfortunately, both of them were big business, and that made it necessary for the administrator to listen to them. Clayton opened the conversation with a pleasant grunt. Prosa followed it up with, "I suppose these disasters mean we shall have to pull out?" "I haven't said so," answered the administrator. He wanted to tell them that he was extremely busy and that he wished them both to hell and out of it. He fought it down with iron-hard control. They were human beings, he told himself. They have their rights. They are entitled to the same courtesies as I would extend to my friends or any other member of the proto-colonial expedition. "Would you like to sit down, gentlemen?" His voice was icy, frigid, but polite. They couldn't force him to sound pleasant. A tone of voice is a man's own business, but at least he had offered them a seat. "Thanks," Clayton conceded, a little gratitude. It was extremely unlike him. Neither Clayton nor Prosa believed in manners. They only believed that money talked, and that the louder it talked, the less need there was for any politeness. The administrator watched with veiled amusement while his perspiring guests lowered their creaking bulks into two plastic armchairs. "I hope you are quite comfortable, gentlemen," he said, and there was just a faint touch of irony in his voice. "This'll do," said Prosa. "We didn't come to get comfortable, we came to talk." "Oh yes, quite. I see you are smoking, gentlemen, but there are some cigarettes on the desk if you'd like one. Would you care for tea or coffee?" "Only drink whiskey," returned Clayton. "Got a limited capacity. Seems a pity to fill a stomach with tea or coffee when you can fill it with whiskey." "I'm afraid I haven't any whiskey," said Walcott rather coolly. "These damn government officers are all the same," grunted Prosa. "Never any decent hospitality, to offer a man. The administrator had been on the point of making a savage retort, but again iron discipline forbade it. "What exactly can I do for you?" he asked after a long and rather awkward pause. "Well, as I said when we came in," retorted Clayton, "you must know what we're thinking." "You mean about going back?" asked Walcott. "Precisely," snapped Prosser. "Obviously you can't expect me to be terribly favourable to continuing the proto-colonial experiment in the present conditions," said the administrator, choosing his words with great care. "You mean you're not going to run? You're going to quit? You're going to show the yellow streak?" said Prosser. "I wouldn't have put it quite that way," said the administrator. "So far, we have been extremely lucky." "Lucky?" interrupted Clayton. "Why, there's been thousands of pounds worth of damage done. Reckoning up in interstellar credits, I reckon." "Well, never mind what you reckon," said the administrator. "Very fortunately, that's not all your problem." "Of course it's my problem," snapped Prosser. "It's everybody's problem," rapped Clayton. "We got money in it, don't you understand? Big money. Yellow gold has been invested in this proto-colonial enterprise. There are things which are much more important than money from the government's point of view," said the administrator, and this time there was really an acid edge to his voice. "You want to tell that to the taxpayers and just see how long you remain an administrator, Mr. Assistant Administrator?" "Following Mr. Fletcher Starbuck's death," said Earl Walcott coldly, "I am the administrator, and I will thank you gentlemen to remember that. I know that you hold considerable influence. I know that your threats are not idle ones, but I would remind you that I am the law here on Kolar. You will find it very advisable to remain civil." All right, soothed Prosser. "Don't get on your high horse over it. The whole point is we've got so much invested here, we don't want to pull out. I can't put it any other plainer than that." "I see," answered Walcott. "It's like that, is it? It doesn't matter how much suffering is caused, how many people starve to death, or how many people die as a result of infection, which will no doubt be caused by the rotting of the ground crops and the drowned animals. These things are unimportant. All that matters is that Mr. Clayton and Mr. Prosser do not lose any of their blasted money." By God, how low can you sink? Human life is being risked, exposed every minute. It's only by a series of inexplicable warning miracles that we have not already lost many valuable lives. And all you bloated... He cut himself short. He had been about to use a word that he had last used in his barrack room days. "Ah, so that's how you feel about it," said Clayton. "You're not concerned with the taxpayers' money." "I am very concerned with finance, very concerned indeed. As administrator, it is one of my most pressing problems, economic wealth, but at the same time I put it to you that a great deal more important, though you don't see it that way, is the conservation of human life. Let us assume for argument's sake that we have lost financially several million credits, several million pounds sterling, or whatever denomination you happen to be reckoning in, dollars, rubles, anything you like. We have lost a certain amount of economic wealth, measured monetary tokens that can be replaced by more effort, more work, higher yield, more efficiency. If one human life is lost, it can never be replaced." "Why? Have people stopped breeding?" asked Clayton sarcastically. "You know perfectly well what I mean," returned Walcott coldly, and now he was really angry. Unpleasant as you are, Mr. Clayton, it would be impossible to replace you. There would never be another John Clayton exactly like you. There are many men who resemble you superficially, but your heart, your mind, your thoughts, your feelings, your soul, call it what you like, there is only one, and you are irreplaceable. So am I, so is Prosa, so is every single colonist, every man, woman and child, no matter how little they may be worth financially. Each of them is of equal value from a humanitarian point of view. My life, your life, Dan Jeffries' life, Glenn Bridges' life, even Fletcher Starbuck's life, none of us are worth more than the poorest youngest child of the poorest colonists, and none of us are worth less. Oh, that's a lovely sermon, sneered Prosa, but it still doesn't answer our question. I don't intend to answer your question, said the administrator. I do not intend to answer it simply because I do not know the answer myself yet. You have your rights as financial backers of the project, and I would be one of the first to admit that without the help of the financial backing that you and others like you have given, the project would be in trouble. That colonial expansion program would slow down. It's going slowly enough now, heaven knows, but without the capital which you gentlemen are prepared to invest, it wouldn't get anywhere. I'm not saying that you invest the capital from the right motives. You very probably don't. You don't think in terms of expansion and progress. You think only in terms of what kind of return you're going to get on your money. I know all about that. Again, I'm not going to preach you a sermon. At least that's not my sole intention. What I'm trying to tell you is this. If things get any worse, and it looks as if life is going to be really savagely imperiled. It's been imperiled already, said Prosa. Well, it has and it hasn't, said the administrator, because before all these mysterious disasters that overtook us so suddenly and mysteriously, there was a warning. I'm telling you this in the strictest confidence. I thought you'd foreseen them coming. Well, we did and we didn't. The administrator realized that he had said something he shouldn't have said. Prosa and Clayton were onto it like ferrets after a rabbit. What do you mean about these warnings? Persisted Prosa. I'm making no further comment. I said something rather inadvertent, rejoined Walcott coolly. You're telling me you did? What you're trying to suggest is that these things have been deliberately caused, said Clayton, and that you know about it. You're shielding someone. I'm not shielding anyone, snarled the administrator. Now will you get the hell out of here before I call my assistant and have you thrown out? You'll hear a lot more of this, blustered Prosa. You'll hear a hell of a lot more of this, snarled Clayton. I don't care, bawled the assistant administrator. He had been without sleep and short of food for a long time, and he was angry. He was not a big man, but there was something about his personality that left Clayton and Prosa in no doubt at all about the advisability of getting out when he said so. You'll hear more of this, threatened Clayton again. You can write it out in triplicate and nail it on the wall as far as I'm concerned, snarled Walcott. And if I find you spreading any alarmist rumours, I shall see to it that you are placed under restraint. You wouldn't dare, said Clayton. Oh, wouldn't I? Demanded Walcott. I'll tell you something else. If I find it necessary, because of anything that you may or not say, to declare a state of emergency, I shall arraign you both on a charge of subversion and have you executed on the spot. You wouldn't get the backing, said Prosa, but there was fear in his voice. "There are men you cannot buy," said the administrator, "and one of those men is my friend Glenn Bridger, who is chief of the IPF. If I decide that you are going to be executed for subversion, Bridger will back me up, and he has the whole of the IPF behind him." "This is barbaric. This is a lynch law. You can't suppress us like that." "I shall suppress you any way I can. Now shut up and get out," commanded the administrator. They went, and they went fast. The administrator sat down, opened the drawer at the bottom of his desk, and produced a half bottle of brandy, poured himself a stiff measure, and tossed it back. He wiped the glass out with a serviette and replaced it in the drawer. It made him laugh as he held the bottle in his hand. Good brandy, he considered, was far too fine a thing to be wasted on characters like Clayton and Prosa. He had obeyed the laws of hospitality. He had offered them tea or coffee, and they had turned down tea and coffee. They certainly weren't going to get his brandy. He put it away in the drawer lovingly. He could feel the warmth of the fluid coursing through his veins. It made him feel better. He wondered whether the colossal bluff that he had pulled on them would silence them. He wished that he had not opened his mouth about the warnings. He wished, above all, that Glenn Bridger was back. He wanted somebody to talk to. He knew deep within himself that neither he nor Bridger would execute anybody for subversion or anything else. But he knew that fear was about the only thing that would work on Clayton and Prosa. You just couldn't appeal to their higher nature. They just hadn't got any. He opened the window to let out their cigar smoke. The smell of their greasy, sweaty bodies, their odor annoyed him intensely. He knew many fine businessmen, many financiers who were straight as guns, but he supposed that men like Clayton and Prosa cropped up everywhere. They were the worm in the social apple. They were the maggot in the heart of the nut of society. He felt better as he breathed in fresh, clean air, but after another sniff, the air didn't seem so clean or so fresh. It was carrying with it the faint but unmistakable tang of putrescence. The flood water had done its work. Dead fish, dead animals, dead plants, fetid, stinking, swampy, jungly smells. Even the smoke of the admin office was preferable to that. Walcott closed the window, opened the drawer, and poured himself another brandy. He replaced bottle and glass in the drawer and sat, with his head buried in his hands, thinking. He was disturbed by a noise from outside, a noise that grew louder as he listened, a chanting noise. What the devil was that, he asked himself. A demonstration of some kind? Why the hell had Fletcher Starbuck gone like that? Why had it all been thrown to him? He remembered a line of Shakespeare, something about the time was out of joint. Oh, that's how it had gone. The time was out of joint, and oh, that I had ever been born to put it right. He wondered whether the original had ever been like that, but it was nearly 14 centuries since those words had been written. Amazing how the really worthwhile things lived on, thought the administrator. Why was it all on his back? Why was he having to carry the load? He was sick and tired of carrying the load. He was tired of the natural disasters, the unnatural disasters, strange warnings, and things that just didn't make any kind of sense anymore. Nothing made any kind of sense anymore. The whole thing was crazy. He was crazy. The whole blasted planet was crazy. Clayton and Prosa were crazy. The administrator was rapidly getting to the end of his rope, and now there was that noise outside. Damn the noise outside. Well, he'd show 'em. He'd arrest the lot. But he would keep order. there was going to be no panic on this planet, or his name wasn't Earl Walcott. He got up, squared his shoulders, rang for his assistant. "What seems to be the trouble out there?" "Colonists demonstrating, sir," answered the assistant. "That's so. All right. Let's go and see what they want, shall we?" And he stepped out onto the porch of the admin building. Chapter 13. The Face from the Grave. There was a big crowd of colonists waiting outside as Earl Walcott and his principal assistant went out to meet them, all as red-eyed, as weary as he was. It was a crowd that was reaching the end of its tether. He estimated there must have been 200 or 300. They must have come in from a pretty big area. Whether the demonstration was spontaneous or whether somebody had organized it, he didn't know. It seemed pretty spontaneous and genuine at the moment. He was prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt. There was a noise as he appeared. It couldn't be called a cheer, it couldn't be called a boo, it was just a noise. It was a mixture of cheering and booing, it was a mixture of shouting. Some of it was approbation, some of it was not. He held up his hand for silence. Somehow he felt strangely dramatic as he made the gesture. He almost wanted to say, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." He smiled inwardly at the thought. "I come to bury Kohler," he thought. "I come to bury all our hopes and dreams, not to praise them." Clayton and Prosser had been determined that the colonists must be made to fight on so that Clayton and Prosser's money would not be wasted. He wondered what the colonists wanted. Did they want to stay on, or was it a deputation asking to go home? He looked at their tired, weary, haggard faces, inflamed by heat and adverse atmosphere, some of them still wet, bedraggled with mud from the knee downwards, as they had ploughed through the swamps in their fields. What could he say to them? Apparently the angry ones were angry about Clayton and Prosser. They had seen Clayton and Prosser going in, and they had seen them leaving. He held up his hand for silence again. He heard somebody shout something about being in the pay of the investors. He shook his head and continued to hold up his hand for quiet. He was rapidly losing his patience. Still, there was no silence. He remembered an old reissue of a very ancient western that he had seen. When the hero had wanted silence, he had drawn a gun and fired it up into the air. That he had done it. The administrator drew a powerful hand blaster. Most people wore hand blasters in the colonies. There was no knowing what you were going to meet round the corner, even though you had been on a world for some time and thought it was fairly safe. He pulled the hand blaster out, waved it dramatically, and fired into the air. There was a crackling sheet of flame, a bang and a cloud of blue sparks as the energy dissipated itself in the upper atmosphere. After that, there was silence, and in the silence the administrator began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I don't know what you have come to see me about, but whatever it is, I am going to tell you 2 things now. In the first place, no decision which I will make has been influenced in any way by anything other than clear, deliberate judgment. I cannot be bought, and I cannot be frightened into making a decision. Now, having got that clear, let me hear what it is that you want to see me about." There was an angry murmur from one section, and he heard the name Prosser mentioned again. "I know that you have seen Prosser and Clayton coming and going from my office. They did not come at my invitation. They have not done a deal with me, and if anybody can prove that they have, I will resign the administration to that man now, and he's welcome to it." The murmurs of disapproval died away. "Thank you," said Walcott. His eyes were flashing fire, and anger was driving out the exhaustion and the tiredness, the irritability that came as the result of no sleep. "I want to know, first of all, why you are here," he said. "Have you got a spokesman who will tell me what this deputation is all about?" "We want information, sir," said a man at the front of the crowd. He said it civilly enough. "We want to know whether we're going to pull out or whether we're staying or what to do. We don't want to go on sweating and working away here if we're going to pull out and leave everything." "That's a good question," said the administrator, "but I can't answer it. I'm sorry, I don't know. I shall be able to tell you more, I hope, when the IPF chief gets back. We believe that some of these natural disasters are not natural disasters, but have been deliberately caused by something or someone who wants to get us off this planet for reasons of their own. I don't know who, I don't know why, I don't know what. If I did, I assure you that I would tell you. There are a lot of things that we cannot understand. I will be completely frank with you. We do not know why Fletcher Starbuck died. There was certain evidence that could be interpreted in two ways. It made it appear that our late administrator may have committed suicide. There is other evidence that this is not so. We have not found his body. The man who knows most about this is Mr. Jeffries. Is he here?" "Yes, I'm here," said Big Dan. "Mr. Jeffries saw the crash," said the administrator. "Tell them about it, Dan." "Yes, that's right, I saw the crash. I saw the rocket coming down as though it was out of control. It landed beside one of those fissures, beside one of those grey-black mounds. From the way the wreckage was lying, I'd say at a guess that Mr. Starbuck might have gone down the crack. 'Tain't likely, but there weren't nobody. 'Tain't likely a body should go down a crack, I suppose, but there again, 'tain't likely a man should live after a thing like that. I certainly didn't see him get up and walk away." There was a grim chuckle from several parts of the crowd, and then Earl Walcott clutched his assistant for support, for he had seen a face in the crowd, a face from the grave. Everybody's attention was on the fainting administrator, and when Walcott recovered himself, the face had gone, but he was sure that he had seen it. This was not one of the disasters, the result of ergotime poisoning, as Big Dan's visions had been. This was not the result of overindulgence. This was not a crazy nightmare or bad dream. This was a fact. Stark, straightforward fact. He had seen Fletcher Starbuck. He had been standing at the back of the crowd. Someone pushed his way through the crowd that was clustering round the collapsing administrator. It was a doctor. He opened a medical case and gave Walcott an injection. Walcott smiled weakly and tried to speak, but the shock, together with the privations and strains of the past few days, had rendered him completely incoherent. All he could do was gasp and point. Heads in the crowd began to turn, but nobody saw anything unusual. Nobody saw anything of interest. Still holding on to the doctor with one hand and his assistant with the other, Walcott got unsteadily to his feet. He rose shakily, reached for his outdoor glasses and stared at the crowd again, but there was no sign of the face he had seen. Had it all been a vision? Had it been a dream? Had it been some strange hallucination? Could he trust his own senses? He knew that hallucination was a strange thing, and that when the mind is under pressure, it will produce rather odd phenomena entirely spontaneously. This hadn't been a strange mental phenomena. This had been real. Walcott was sure it had been real. He had seen Fletcher Starbuck, but dead men don't walk about at the back of demonstrating crowds. Maybe everybody has a double, but this seemed so similar. Walcott recovered his power of speech, which the shock had temporarily deprived him. "Starbuck," he whispered to the doctor. "I saw Fletcher Starbuck there in the crowd. That's what made me collapse. It was like seeing a face from the grave. It was like seeing a dead man walk around again." "Are you sure?" asked the doctor. "Positive, absolutely positive." "I think you'd better go home and rest," advised the doctor. "When did you last get any sleep?" "I've forgotten," said Walcott with grim humour. "I thought as much," returned the doctor. "I'm going to see that you go home, get put to bed, and I'll give you a sedative." "Oh," said Walcott, "I think I've stood all I can at the moment." He slept the clock round and halfway round again. He was finally aroused with a cup of tea and the announcement that the IPF chief, Glenn Bridger, was back from Orbit 1. "Are you well enough to see him, sir?" "Of course I am. Silly of me to collapse like that." "Not at all, sir," said his assistant. "I couldn't have stood it half as long as you have." "You're being modest," said Walcott. "You've been on your feet longer than I have now. You need rest just as much." "I haven't got all the responsibility, sir," returned his assistant. "That's the thing. If I have to make a decision and I'm in doubt, I can refer to you. If you're in doubt, you can't refer to anybody. You know that you have my complete and sympathetic support, if I may say so, sir. Absolutely 100%. "Well, that's very consoling," said Walcott, and he said it sincerely. Walcott sat up in bed as Bridger entered. He was sipping his tea as he looked at the IPF chief. "What the devil have you been doing in my absence?" said Bridger. "Can't leave you alone for 5 minutes. Your number 1 assistant there tells me you've been seeing ghosts. Have you had any of that ergotine, do you think?" "No, this wasn't ergotine vision. It wasn't a ghost either. This was the real McCoy." "You mean you honestly believe Fletcher Starbuck is alive?" said Bridger. "I believe it as surely as I believe that you're alive. I believe it as surely as I believe that I myself am alive. I saw his face in the crowd. He looked strained and bewildered, but he was there, and he knew that I'd seen him. I'm sure he knew that I'd spotted him. Then I just sort of flopped out. Everybody surged towards me and the doctor came. After that, by the time I'd recovered and looked again, he'd gone." "I wonder what he wanted if it was him," said Bridger. "There's no if about it. It was him. WAS was, not might have been, it was." "Well, I've got to combine that," said Bridger, "with what I've discovered on Orbit 1, or rather, with what I failed to discover. There's absolutely nothing there. Not a thing, so it looks now if there is any connection between this strange sequence of events, that somehow or other Fletcher Starbuck is at the back of it." "Certainly looks that way," agreed Walcott. "What are we going to do?" asked the IPF chief. "I wish I knew," said Earl Walcott fervently. "I wish I knew." Chapter 14. Starbuck Trail. Glenn Bridger came away from the administrator's bedroom feeling more puzzled in some respects than when he had gone in, and rather less bewildered in others. The problem was not solving itself, but it was changing a little. He knew that all things else being equal, Earl Walcott was a singularly reliable man. But then He had believed that Fletcher Starbuck was a singularly reliable man, and his judgment, not to say his faith in human nature, had received a shattering blow. However, maybe the way that things were adding up now in the security man's mind was not any change of character on the part of Starbuck which was responsible for the peculiar mental aberrations that had led to his apparent misappropriation of the funds and his supposed suicide. There was a little glimmer of light in the darkness of uncertainty in the IPF chief's mind. He had scarcely covered a dozen paces towards his hovercraft, which waited, engine ticking, outside the offices of the administrator, when he heard its radio jangling shrilly, like a singularly discordant telephone bell of the ancient 20th century, like a cross between a telephone bell and a crazy alarm clock with bad neurosis. He sprinted across the few remaining paces and lifted the radio telephone receiver. "Bridger here." "Sergeant speaking, sir," came familiar tones from the other end. "What is it, Sergeant? Something urgent?" "Yes, sir, very urgent." "Well, shoot," ordered Bridger. "One of the men has just reported something extremely queer. I'm keeping him under observation." "The man or the thing he's reported?" demanded Bridger. "The man, sir. He's supposed to have seen Fletcher Starbuck." "Seen Starbuck?" "Swore he saw him, sir, making his way from the crowd of demonstration. He couldn't get to him because the crowd was in the way, but he's prepared to stake his entire reputation on it." "Well, he's not the only one. Why have you just let me know this? It was some time ago." "You haven't been back more than half an hour, sir," replied the sergeant inoffensively, "and you went straight to the admin building. I didn't think you'd want disturbing while you were talking to Mr. Walcott." "Good man," approved Bridger. "Sorry I snarled. You can't let me know things if I'm getting off to Orbit 1, can you? Okay, then you can release that man at once. He's telling the absolute truth. He has seen Fletcher Starbuck. The administrator saw him as well." "My God!" ejaculated the sergeant. "He's back from the dead?" "I wouldn't put it quite as dramatically as that," said the IPF chief. "It's a bit startling, isn't it? Look, let that man out from observation. Apologize to him and tell him I'll be there in a minute, Sergeant." "I'm sorry, sir. He's always been a reliable man. Tell him it'll go down on his promotion list. That'll mollify him," said the IPF man. "Right, sir, I'll do that. I'm sorry about the misunderstanding, sir, but with you not here I didn't know what to do." All right, said the IPF chief wearily. "A perfectly understandable mistake has been made. If somebody had come wandering up to me and said he'd seen a ghost, I shouldn't have been very inclined to believe him either. In the present state of emergency, I'd have done exactly what you've done. Now, there's no harm done. Thank you for telling me so quickly. It will enable us to get his track, if the trail isn't ice cold by now." When Bridger arrived back at his headquarters, he found that the trooper who had been restrained for the last 36 hours was just a little bit disgruntled, but it was wearing off. "Sorry about the misunderstanding," said Bridger at once, "but if I'd been in the sergeant's place, I'd probably have done just the same thing. It so happens that the administrator saw exactly what you did. That's what made him faint." "It made me feel a bit queer, sir, but I'm jolly glad my testimony has been confirmed by the administrator himself." "Yes, and the administrator will be pretty glad that you've confirmed his testimony. Put in the chief. Now, tell me exactly what you saw." "Well, 2 or 3 of us were trying to keep the edge of the crowd under control. There was a bit of barracking going on from 1 or 2 extremists at the back. The kind of chap I call a progressional agitator. Doesn't know what he's agitating about, but he just likes to make a hell, you know, sir." "I know exactly. Very good way of putting it," said Bridger. "And then what happened next?" "Well, sir, the administrator suddenly paused, then he clasped at the assistant from the office who was beside him, and the next minute he collapsed. Then the doctor came and everybody surged round to see what had happened. It looked rather like the assassination of Lincoln, you know." "Yes, I know, indeed. I should imagine that happens at every assassination. Everyone rushes forward to see what's happening." "Well, it did look as if somebody had struck the administrator down with an invisible weapon, one of those devilishly thin beam energy guns. Though I couldn't think of anybody who'd want to assassinate Mr. Walcott. He's a damn good administrator." "He's an excellent administrator," agreed Bridger. "And then?" went on the man. "As I turned and I looked instinctively towards Mr. Walcott, I realized it was my duty as an officer to look and see if there was an assassin. I looked immediately towards the spot where Mr. Walcott had been looking, because that appeared to be in some way connected with his collapse, and then I saw someone moving away swiftly. I struggled through the crowd as best I could, but I couldn't get there in time." "You saw someone moving away? You didn't see the face then?" "Yes, I did see the face, sir, because he glanced over his shoulder, and that's what stopped me dead in my tracks, sir, for a second or two, and possibly gave him the chance to escape." "Well, who was it?" asked Bridger, although he knew the answer before he asked. "It was the late administrator, sir. It was Fletcher Starbuck." "Incredible," said Glenn Bridger. "And yet it's got to be. It's just got to be. I believe Walcott, and I believe you, and I believe both of you doubly because you are corroborating each other. You've done very well, Trooper. It must have been very tempting for you to say that you had had an hallucination after the sergeant wouldn't believe you, especially if he had placed you under restraint. I believe he has already told you that you are being recommended for promotion for tenacity." "Thank you very much indeed, sir. That makes it all worthwhile, sir." "That's not all the compensation I'd like to give you," said Bridger, "but it's just one of those things. It's the best we can do at the moment. As soon as there's a vacancy, I'll see that you're put forward for it." "Thank you, sir. Thank you again." "All right. Dismiss," said Bridger. The constable went off duty. "This is a funny kettle of fish," went on Bridger, turning to his sergeant. "It is that, sir." "I don't know what to make of it." The IPF chief was pacing up and down, crushing one great fist into the palm of the other hand as though to emphasize the steps that he was taking. "I don't know what to make of it," he repeated dourly. "Send out an all-personnel call to look out for Fletcher Starbuck. Tell 'em anything you like. It's got to be kept confidential. We don't want a general sort of panic. When he's sighted, if he's sighted, no action to be taken. But I must be radioed immediately. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, sir," said the sergeant. "He is not to be apprehended or interfered with in any way, just kept under observation." "Exactly," said Glenn Bridger. "You've got it right on the dot, Sergeant. I'm going to retire into my office and get some sleep. I don't want disturbing unless it's absolutely essential. Short of the office flying on fire, I don't want to know anybody's here." "I know, sir. Only grade 1 emergencies will concern you." "That's it, Bridger." He strode into his office, slammed the door rather imperiously behind him, threw himself down into the comfortable, thick plastic foam armchair and thought, and thought and thought. He went into one of his Sherlock Holmes reveries. The space and pace of his thoughts moved sometimes quickly, sometimes more slowly, and gradually the glimmer of light in the darkness at the back of his mind began to make a little sense. He had been there about an hour when the sergeant tapped on the door respectfully. Bridger knew it was the sergeant's tap. Every man in the office had his own distinctive style of knock. "Come in," called Bridger. The thinking had not been going terribly well just then. He was not sorry to have the interruption. The sergeant's eyes were sparkling. "We found him, sir. He's been sighted on Highway 17. Highway 17 was a bit of a misnomer, but all the roads were numbered, and this particular dirt track, which connected two of the homesteads about 17 miles out from the admin building, was known as Highway 17. Roads as such were not terribly necessary during the early stages of colonial development because of the many advantages of the hovercraft over the more conventional wheeled vehicles. When the place got settled down, more orthodox wheeled transport would come in and big building projects would be undertaken. But colonists did not spend fortunes on roads when they need all they can to wring a living out of the angry, hostile, recalcitrant soil. "He's been kept under observation as instructed, sir," said the sergeant. "Splendid," said Bridger. "Absolutely splendid." He was out of the office like a shot from a gun, pausing only to check his hand weapons as a matter of course. He was in his hovercraft, speeding away towards 17. He made radio contact with the patrolman, who was on duty in that section of the highway. "I just saw Mr. Starbuck, sir," radioed the patrolman. "I'm keeping well behind him. He's flying a small solo hovercraft and he's heading off towards one of the big mounds, one of the grey-black mounds with several large fissures beside it, just towards the west of the highway. He's about half a mile ahead of me. I can see his craft quite distinctly heading towards the mound." "Right," said Bridger, and opened up the throttle of his own hovercraft. The powerful machine skimmed across the land. It covered the distance very, very rapidly indeed. It was a matter of minutes only before he found himself in sight of the grey-black ash mound, and the fissures towards which Starbuck had been reported as heading. He saw the patrolman's hovercraft some distance away and sped towards it. The officer handed him a powerful pair of binoculars. "There you are, sir," he said simply. Looking through the field glasses, Bridger could see that it was absolutely true. He could see every detail. He could see Starbuck's face bent intently over the controls of his hovercraft. He saw him side profile and slightly back. There was no mistaking Fletcher Starbuck. It was the expression, though, rather than the sight of the supposedly dead administrator, that really made the police chief catch his breath. It was a dazed, glazed, hypnotized expression, as though he were an automaton or a zombie obeying some weird kind of impulsive command he knew not why. The IPF chief had seen enough. He put his own vehicle into rapid acceleration, and he and the duty constable made their way swiftly in the wake of Starbuck's own skimming disc. Chapter 15. Into the Fissure. "You've done a good job of observation," said Bridger. "Yes, sir," answered his trooper. "What's your name?" "George Johnson, sir," answered the constable. "I'll remember that. Must have been very tempting to go after him yourself." "It was, really, sir, but we had our orders." "Well, that's the kind of reaction I'd like to get from my men," commended Bridger. "I'll see to it that you don't lose anything by this. Well done, Johnson." "Thank you, sir," replied Johnson, visibly burning with pride. Bridger kept a safe distance behind Starbuck's hovercraft, but he wondered as he did so whether there was any need to take precautions. Starbuck was like a man in a daze. It was like following a robot, like following an automaton, like following some kind of servo mechanism. It was uncanny, really. It was like being on the trail of a zombie. Starbuck appeared to have no eyes or ears except for the course immediately ahead of him. Bridger handed over the controls to the IPF trooper and kept his eyes glued on Starbuck's face through the glasses. Could he have made a mistake? Was this really Starbuck? Another thought crossed his mind. Could it be a dummy made up to resemble Starbuck? For some strange reason that was beyond his comprehension. Could that be the secret? Could that be the answer to the problem? But no. That was a living man at the controls. That was no robot, though it looked robot-like. And yet, he thought, even with powerful glasses, how can I be sure at this distance whether it is Starbuck or a robot that looks like Starbuck? If it was a robot, what was the point of it? Why? Was it a deliberate trap? Thought the security chief. Were he and the constable being led deliberately towards that fissure by a person or persons unknown, for purpose or purposes unknown, and probably unpleasant? He allowed himself to be led, however. This was the lead that they had needed, and he was not going to abandon it now for the sake of caution. He made radio contact with the sergeant back at the headquarters just in case there was any kind of trap into which he was walking. "If you lose contact, Sergeant," he said, "you know what to do." "I will get a patrol out there immediately, sir. We'll get you out, sir. Have no fear." "Right. I'm going to make 10-minute contacts. If for any reason you don't get a contact, you will start off immediately." "Immediately, sir." "Good," said Bridger. The ship they were following had stopped. It had stopped by one of the fissures at the base of one of the grey-black ash mounds. It was a big mound, a square mile or a square mile and a half in area. It might have been more. Bridger didn't like the mounds at all. There was a sinister, forbidding, foreboding atmosphere, as though a sad and yet rather dangerous presence lingered and hung around them from a bygone era. It was as though the mound spoke of other days, long dead days far beyond recall. Bridger alighted as the skimmer came to a standstill. "Edge her slowly, slowly closer," he whispered. "And if you think he's looking, just keep on course until you're right past him. Leave me here, I'll hide in the swamp." It was up to his knees, and in the distance he could hear the sound of water gurgling down the side of the fissure. Starbuck, if it was Starbuck, had also alighted. Bridger crouched low in the swamp while the trooper kept the skimmer moving slowly. The IPF chief moved forward. His eyes were glued on Fletcher Starbuck. Starbuck was uncoiling what looked like a long rope from his skimmer. Surely, thought Bridger, he's never going down that fissure. And yet it seemed the only likely explanation for Starbuck's action. Slowly, relentlessly, remorselessly, Bridger closed the gap. He was close enough now to see there were knots in the rope. He thought about climbing. So he is going down then. Going down that fissure in the mud and the steam. There was very little steam now, but Bridger knew the fissure must be deep in mud and water. The whole area had been flooded. Presumably some of the water had drained out again at the base of the fissure, but heaven alone knew where it had drained to, into the subterranean caverns of unbelievable depths, he assumed. It was the only logical assumption. Maybe the heat had dried it all out, but even then it would have left some gooey, alluvial deposit, or maybe it had dried it out completely and it would be baked hard like iron. It was impossible to tell. He watched as Starbuck shut out the engine of his disc skimmer, lowered it to the ground, and then with his rope secured it to it, began to climb steadily hand over hand over the edge of the crevice into God alone knew what in the darkness. Bridger threw caution to the winds, and now he was looking over the side of the crevice. Down below he could see a tiny point of light. Starbuck had some means of illumination with him. Bridger watched as the light grew dimmer and further away. He watched as it grew smaller and smaller still until it was just a tiny point of light way down in the bottom of the fissure. It stopped, getting smaller, and began moving away horizontally. Apparently Starbuck had reached a ledge of some kind. Glenn Bridger was in two minds about what to do next. He waved a hand to the constable. Johnson stopped the disc ship immediately. "What do you want me to do, sir?" he called softly over the edge of the cockpit. "I want you to stay here. I'm going over the fissure. I want you to stay here and watch for any kind of trouble. I don't know what kind of trouble I'm expecting, but it could be absolutely anything. Just keep alert and keep up the radio contact, will you? I've got a small set in my pocket, and I'm going to keep up 10-minute contacts with you in headquarters. If I don't make one, contact headquarters immediately, will you, as an extra precaution?" "Right, sir," said Johnson, and he looked apprehensively at the broad, retreating back of Glenn Bridger. The IPF chief started down the rope which Starbuck, or the thing that looked like Starbuck, had left dangling over the edge of the crevice.